It was the most tragic episode in America's history. During 4 years of bitter and bloody fighting between the North and the South, more than 600,000 soldiers lost their lives, while thousands more returned to civilian life crippled and maimed. There was hardly a family in the land that had not been affected in some way by the dreadful fighting. And for those who had lived through the war, life would never be the same again. From the first shots at Fort Sumter in 1861 to the emotional Confederate surrender at Appomattox Courthouse in 1865, these programs tell the epic story of a conflict that scarred the soul of our nation. This is the story of the American Civil War.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch.
In all social systems, there must be a class to do the menial duties, to perform the drudgery of life. Fortunately for the South, she found a race adapted to that purpose.
But now I'm found.
In thinking of America, I sometimes find myself admiring her bright blue skies, her fertile fields, her mighty lakes and star-crowned mountains. But my rapture is soon checked when I remember that all is cursed with the infernal spirit of slaveholding and wrong.
Sold my heart to fear.
We desire no trading, no mechanical or manufacturing classes. As long as we have our rice, our sugar, our tobacco, and cotton, we can command wealth to purchase all we want.
I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood.
The truth was that the northern states and the southern states of America were on a collision course for many years before the first fateful shots of the Civil War were fired. For the two sides that would spend 4 blood-soaked years at war with each other, there was perhaps no other way to settle their differences. They had in most respects become irreconcilably divided, like two strangers living in the same house.
The people of these two sections shared a common history. They shared the same constitution. They shared the same religions. They shared the same language. The one big thing that was separating these two sections was the existence of slave labor below the Mason-Dixon line and the existence of free labor and no slave labor north of the Mason-Dixon line.
The Industrial Revolution had well and truly come to the North by the Civil War. And the North was an industrialized economy. Pittsburgh was belching out steel by the time of the American Civil War. And in the South, there was an agrarian economy that was tied to producing goods, especially cotton, but also tobacco, for instance. And it meant that the Southern economy was far more dependent on retaining the idea of unfree labor, as opposed to the North, which was perfectly willing to enslave theoretically free people as factory workers. Southern Americans before the Civil War thought of themselves as closely ethnically connected with the British Isles, and thought of themselves as far more closely connected than the Northerners. And in the racial theories of the time, that meant that Southerners viewed themselves as a sort of ethnically pure British stock, as opposed to the Northerners, who had all sorts of Hungarians and Germans and Jews polluting the ethnic purity of the native British stock. And this sort of thought was common in the 19th century. It shaped people's view of themselves as a nation, and it meant that people in the South viewed themselves as quite superior to Northerners.
The stereotypical cardboard cutout of a Southerner would be an indolent, lazy slave owner or slave driver who's afraid of hard work, who's not at all interested in anything except his own aristocratic heritage, his pretentious lineage, his cavalier blue blood inside him, and the purity of the lady who's hanging on to his arm. Similarly, the stereotypical Northerner would be a pasty-faced shop clerk or a wage slave or a grimy factory hand, corrupted by the decadence of the northern cities, chasing after the almighty dollar, rubbing shoulders with the great unwashed, the immigrants festering in their crowded tenements in New York or Boston or someplace.
Northerners are going to perceive a given image of a stereotypical Southerner, just like a Southerner is going to perceive a certain image of a Northerner. But they were all Americans up to that point in time.
America had changed beyond all recognition since winning its independence from Britain in 1776. At that time, its population numbered only 4 million. By 1861, that number had swollen to 31 million, thanks in part to an influx of German and Irish immigrants. Many of the 27 million new Americans had settled in the North. The country's largest city was New York, which was then the home to more than 500,000 people. Chicago, a mere point on the map in 1830, had grown to hold a population of 100,000. On the other hand, the largest, indeed the only major city in the South, was New Orleans, which was populated by 150,000 people. Great advances and improvements in transportation and communications had had a dramatic effect on American society. The enormous new opportunities offered by booming cities and towns sparked a rush away from the traditional settlements and villages of the country. The figures are startling. In 1820, a mere 1 in 14 of the population lived in the city. But only 40 years later, over 1/5 of the population had become city dwellers. This huge demographic shift also ensured that when war broke out, the North enjoyed an enormous numerical advantage over its enemy. There were some 20 million Northerners, but only 9 million Southerners. Crucially for the future of the Union, of those 9 million, more than 4 million were black American slaves, and it was perhaps the issue of slavery, more than any other, which would drive a wedge between the North and the South.
there are economic differences between the North and the South. There are cultural and social differences between the northern section of the country and the southern section of the country. But all of them have as their root, have as their nucleus, if you will, the institution of slavery.
You have those who will state that the Civil War was a war over states' rights, that the South wanted to defend their rights or their independence. However, you have to ask the question, the states' right to do what? They want to defend their property rights, but their property rights in what? And it all revolves around the issue of slavery.
Slavery was the main cause of the Civil War, and as historians pointed out, were there no slavery in the United States of America, there would have been no Civil War. At the same time, it is always worthwhile to point out that only 25% of Southerners actually owned slaves. That left the vast majority non-slaveholders or even related to slaveholders. Insofar as slavery was needed to be the catalyst to start the war, to win over the majority of the Southern population, other issues were needed, and the other issues surrounded the Southern economy and the interpretation of the Constitution, especially states' rights.
You don't leave the wife and kids, you don't leave the family farm, you don't leave your home to go to fight a war over tariffs. It was slavery in the minds of the South that formed the basis of their society. And a threat to the institution of slavery is what motivates the South, and it is perhaps less slavery that motivates the North, but slavery is still the core issue that makes it worth spilling blood in the 1860s, as opposed to making a lot of noise in Congress.
Nobody knows the trouble I've seen.
Slaves had first been imported from Britain to Virginia in 1619. By 1776, 1 in 5 of Americans was black, and a very lucrative trade in slaves had grown, operated mainly by rich Northerners. Although slavery was abolished in 7 states after independence, it was retained in Maryland, Delaware, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. By 1819, the number of slave and free states was equal at 11 each. And as each state, regardless of size, had equal representation in the Senate, a fine political balance came to exist. However, the next few decades were to see the two groups drift inexorably and dangerously apart. Before long, the North, the home of the free states, and the South, the home of the slave states, had evolved into very distinct cultures and economies, and relations between them had deteriorated. An atmosphere of suspicion and mistrust, particularly in the South, came to exist between the two regions.
The trouble I've seen.
Some in the South, some politicians may have exhibited some jealousy because the North had been doing well as a result of the Industrial Revolution. The fact that most of the very large banking interests were in the North, a lot of the shipping and commercial interests were in the North. The fact that there were so many miles of railroads in the North, but the South, the people of the South had these opportunities too. And most in the South chose to remain with their way of life, which was based on that very agrarian and rural lifestyle. There were large cities in the South, don't get me wrong, and there was manufacturing in the South. But the North was doing well, was prospering in the decades of the 1840s and the 1850s.
There wasn't so much resentment over the North's economic prowess, particularly industrialization, but there was irritation in the South at attempts by the North or Northern politicians to pass legislation that they saw was beneficial only to the northern part of the United States, not the South. For instance, tariffs, rivers and harbors bills, and laws designed to support American shipping, the shipbuilding industry, because that was all tied up in the North. So generally, when you see the disputes over the North and the South, it does come down to this question of this industrializing North versus this largely agrarian South. and that was something Southerners did get very angry about.
The feeling that the South had somehow grown apart from the main U.S. economy was given further impetus by the sudden and dramatic rise in demand for cotton, particularly from the hungry textile mills that were booming as part of the Industrial Revolution in England. It was now that the institution of slavery began to pay rich dividends for the South, for its black American slaves provided virtually inexhaustible cheap labor. So much so that by 1861, the South's output of cotton had risen to a staggering 5 million bales per year. But the cotton success story was to have far-reaching effects, for the slave owners chose to reinvest their new wealth, not in agricultural machinery, but in more slaves and land. Very soon, the South's economy was entirely dependent on slave labor.
In the pre-war South, regional or sectional poverty was the price that they paid for the institution of slavery, because slavery impoverishes just about everybody but the small slave-holding elite, in this case the planter class, and perhaps their immediate agents, export firms and transport firms and the like. But for the mass of the Southern populace, both black and white, slavery meant that they were largely denied labor and wages. And the economic argument is pretty clear. If you don't have earning power, you don't have spending power. If you don't have spending power, you don't have money to inject back into the economy to help it diversify, to grow, to expand. And this would have been the case if it were a free economy or a planned economy. It would have been the case if there were 5 million or 4 million white slaves. The economic argument would have been the same. Slavery impoverishes just about everybody.
There were many other notable distinctions between Northern and Southern society. If the Northerner likes to make money, the Southerner likes to spend it, went a popular saying. And there is no doubt that the Southern population saw itself as happy-go-lucky, impulsive, generous, respectful, and honorable. Men were polite and chivalrous to women. The South despised what it believed to be the greedy and grasping Northern society, with its addiction to profit and loose morals.
Southern society as happy-go-lucky and chivalrous and those other stereotypical sort of things, it is to some extent an accurate snapshot. Southern society is a very classist society. Now, they didn't so much see themselves as happy-go-lucky. They saw themselves as most wealthy Southerners were a very serious group of people. I mean, they might gamble, they might like to go to horse races or race their horses, but they saw themselves as a very serious group of individuals, and they were very paternalistic. They ruled over a manor with servants, and so they had a very high ideal of themselves. As far as chivalrous, yes. They thought that they lived in a land of chivalry. They thought that they were the protectors of their women and their home. And they had somewhat of the old-fashioned and outdated ideas which they connected to Europe and to England, and more to be more specific.
Certainly, that's what many Northerners believed Southern society looked like. But keep in mind, there was a very large section of plain folk, as we would call them, hardworking yeomen, hardworking farmers who didn't gamble, who didn't have hand servants waiting on them all the time. They worked long and hard in the fields in order to provide for their family.
There were, however, other more tangible differences between the Northern and Southern societies. Differences which were perhaps less pleasant for the South to contemplate. For example, over half the population of the Southern states was illiterate. Education was clearly not a Southern priority. for only half as many white Southern children went to school as those from the North. Southern society was also infamous for its violence. Differences were often settled by assaults, revenge beatings, and murders. By contrast, most crime in the North was directed against property, theft, burglary, and fraud. In addition, every Southern state had an organized militia, formed in part to exert control over the ever-increasing slave population.
Well, elements of Southern society were violent. The fact that the institution of slavery was legal in the South, where you could legally beat a slave and scar a slave, I mean, that's pretty violent in itself. And I would think that that would help to breed even more violence.
Thomas Jefferson of Virginia, himself a slaveholder, once described the keeping of slaves as, it was like holding a wolf by the ears. You dare not hold on to it, and you dare not let it go, you know. And the South had seen a number of slave rebellions or attempted slave rebellions in the decades before independence and after independence. And the people who led them demonstrated the real vengeful potential of human beings who the popular culture was busy trying to depict as, clowns, as buffoons, who actually reveled in his bondage.
There was also this idea the Southern Code of Honor led to dueling, which had largely died out everywhere else in the Union, with the exception of the South. And so then dueling was continued on right until the advent of the Civil War.
The Southerner might have viewed himself as a duelist. The Northerner might have viewed the Southerner as an unpredictable madman, given to flights of violence, dueling, and single combat. But I think that nobody has done research which clearly shows that the 19th century New Orleans or Charleston citizen was more violent than a citizen of New York or Boston.
Wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water. Gods are gonna trouble the water. See that
No day ever dawns for the slave, nor is it looked for. For the slave it is all night forever.
the leader looks like the Israelite. Gods are gonna trouble the water.
It is expected that slaves should be at work by the time it is light, and while at work they should be brisk. I have no objection to their whistling lively tunes, but no drawling tunes are allowed, for their work keeps time with the music.
Although not all were treated badly, it is hard to imagine or understand the grim everyday life of most slaves. With every sunrise came the prospect of a day's back-breaking work. With every sunset, the reality of a return to the harshest of living conditions. Born into bondage, a slave knew little else but a life governed by the whim of his master, the man who had complete control of his everyday existence. Sell the slave, beat the slave, or kill the slave. It mattered not, for in the South there was little legal deterrent. A slave could not marry without his owner's permission, and of course the marriage was not legal. As a consequence, familiar, heartbreaking scenes were played out in the southern states as Black American slave families were separated and sold off to different owners throughout the region, never to see each other again.
The daily life of the slave varied according to one's labor practices, according to one's location, and according to the relationship with an owner. I mean, you had slaves living and working in the cities, and you had slaves, in the cotton fields. You could be digging a ditch in the rain, or you could be a cobbler in a workshop with a roof over your head and maybe a nice warm fire in the hearth next to you. So your conditions, your daily conditions as a slave might differ from those of a fellow slave even a few miles down the road.
The Deep South was generally the worst place to be as a slave. The expression downriver, sold downriver, comes from the slave days when owners from the Upper South sold their slaves downriver, meaning down the Mississippi River, to the plantations in the Deep South. Furthermore, some states had laws to protect the slaves, which were better enforced than others. So, for instance, Missouri had laws preventing masters from just murdering their slaves out of hand, and there are records of whites being convicted for murdering slaves. But some states, even though they had these laws in the books, made no effort to enforce them.
You have several groups of slaveholders. You have those who realize that they're dealing with a human being who can be motivated and with certain incentives, and therefore they would try to treat their slaves, if you could think of it, in a nice manner for a slave. Then there were those whose minds had been so tainted by the racial ideologies that developed in the United States, that they believed that slaves could only be motivated by the whip. They saw them as little children who wouldn't listen unless they had been punished, or sometimes feared you. And therefore, they would abuse their slaves for any small infraction. And for the most part, a slave's life is harsh. There is no real good aspect to unfreedom.
But the South knew only economic reality, and it was upon the foundation of slavery that the Southern economy proudly stood. There was no prospect of change, nor was there the will to bring it about. In fact, quite the reverse. The slave economy, with all it brought with it, was soon to be something thousands of men believed was worth fighting and dying for. However, it should not be imagined that the North was a hotbed of desire for social change. Most Northerners outside the evangelicals and the Quakers were at best ambivalent to the plight of the Southern slaves. Indeed, in New York City, the segregation between colors was strictly enforced, and only in desperate poverty of the city's ramshackle housing did black and white coexist in uneasy peace. History records that the early abolitionists, given voice by William Lloyd Garrison's Liberator news sheet, were roundly abused by North and South alike. To many in the North, they were an acute, irritating embarrassment, but to the volatile Southerners, the abolitionists represented a positive threat to their way of life.
The abolitionists were a very radical protest group who believed that slavery was evil, that slave owners were evil, that slavery should be abolished immediately and by any means necessary, to include violence.
The abolitionists were not egalitarians. They did not believe that black people, that African Americans could be equal with them socially or economically or morally. So it is a mistake to view a Northern abolitionist as being a champion of the human rights of the African American slave.
Garrison was a Massachusetts Baptist and unforgiving hater of slavery who saw it as an abomination before God. And he published the country's most fiery abolitionist journal, The Liberator. Its banner cry was, "I will not equivocate and I will be heard," which pretty well sums up his character. I mean, this was a guy who publicly burned the United States Constitution on the 4th of July because it protected slavery. And Garrison was so firebrand that eventually he was seen as an extremist or even a crank, even by many within his ranks.
The kind of people who would read a special purpose newspaper, a political periodical, were the kind of people who would respond to what William Lloyd Garrison had to say. And that makes slavery a nationwide issue in the United States, because if you agree with Garrison then you've got that newspaper in hand to agree with. And if you disagree with Garrison, you must respond to your neighbor who has got a copy of the Liberator on his front table.
Gradually, the abolitionists won greater and wider support. They were helped by books such as Uncle Tom's Cabin, written by Harriet Beecher Stowe.
Stowe was a Connecticut-born evangelist who came from a family of prominent American social reformers. Now, she'd never lived in the South. She lived in Ohio for some time, and she said that everything she knew about slavery she learned from looking across the Ohio River into Kentucky and seeing the practices of chattel slavery there. So in Uncle Tom's Cabin, you have two escaped slaves, George and Eliza, who make it across the north and into Canada with their child, and eventually they settle in Liberia. More problematically, you have the figure of Uncle Tom, who's sort of a Christ-like figure. He's patient, he's meek, unbelievably so. He turns the other cheek, and eventually he becomes a martyr. He's beaten to death by a cruel overseer. And at the time, the book's melodrama and its sentimentality, and in particular its championing of family values, that was the book's great argument, that slavery breaks up families. All these did a lot to unite not only Northern opinion against American slavery, but European opinion as well.
When we look at this book now, we see it as being very much emotive literature, in some ways sentimental, but nonetheless struck a powerful chord. It was published in the National Era in serial form, and it sold 300,000 copies in first publication, and it was a worldwide bestseller.
What Uncle Tom's Cabin does is it makes slavery a popular issue amongst ordinary folk who don't read abolitionist newsletters, who don't perhaps even go to a church where the parson is especially abolitionist. And that's true overseas as well. Uncle Tom's Cabin makes North American slavery, makes American slavery an issue in Canada, it makes American slavery an issue in England, and it makes American slavery an issue when it's published in translation in France as well. Everybody in Europe understands American slavery through the prism of Harriet Beecher Stowe and Uncle Tom's Cabin.
The year 1856 saw the birth of the Republican Party, the first mainstream political party to take a stand against the spread of slavery into the Western territories. Events in Kansas during the 1850s saw the country take another huge step on the road to war. Left to decide for itself whether it should be a free or a slave state, Kansas quickly degenerated into bloody civil strife, earning its unfortunate nickname, Bleeding Kansas. It was more positive proof that it would be almost impossible to settle the issue by peaceful democratic means.
The Republican Party was born out of the pressures of the moment, and it really didn't take long for it to become the dominant political party in the North. But it didn't even exist before 1856, and that's 5 years before the start of the Civil War. It wasn't an abolitionist party as such. It was founded as a party against the extension of slavery into the territories and states out in the West.
They believed that the Western territories should be the enclave of free white labor, that rich Southern plantation owners should not be allowed to move to these territories and take their gangs of slave labor with them, and they would have this unfair economic advantage over the common man, the middle-class man who moves out to the Western territories with his family. So it's not so much that the Republican Party was against slavery, but they were for free labor, especially in the Western territories.
In 1857, the South economy largely escaped the financial chaos that brought about panic in the financial institutions of Wall Street. The fact was that demand for cotton was still as strong as ever, and the South looked on with barely concealed amusement as the Northern economy struggled. To the people of the South, it was yet another reason to protect their chosen way of life. On the night of October 16, 1859, came perhaps the central act in the unfolding drama. This was John Brown's infamous raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, an ill-fated enterprise that was supposed to rouse the slaves into open rebellion. A twice-married farmer who had fathered 20 children, the 59-year-old Brown was a fanatical abolitionist.
I suppose nowadays you'd call John Brown an anti-slavery terrorist, or perhaps a freedom fighter, depending on your moral stance. John Brown was driven by the certainty that God spoke to him and told him to wipe out slavery and the people who perpetuated it. So he proclaimed himself the captain of an anti-slavery guerrilla band in Kansas, and he and his followers cut down a group of pro-slavery settlers at Pottawatomie Creek. And I mean, they did this with broadswords. You know, this was the vengeance of the Lord playing itself out on the plains of bleeding Kansas.
John Brown was a very intense man, and he was sufficiently intense that if you look at a photograph of him, John Brown's eyes come out at you from the photograph. You can see this man's intensity, and you can see that John Brown is a bit crazy. John Brown is not a sane man. He and his family hack people to bits. They launch crackpot plans. They are mad people led by a madman. But he's got perhaps the same kind of mad leadership intensity that Hitler later had in service of a much less worthy and moral cause. And that means that John Brown has the ability to bring people with him, his family and his friends, bring people with him on his mad schemes.
Believing that the Harper's Ferry raid had been given God's blessing, Brown ignored the military procedures that might have given it a greater chance of success. As it turned out, the whole episode was not only a military disaster, it also failed to raise the slaves to rebellious frenzy. Brown's small force of 18 men, which included 3 of his sons, seized the arsenal but were soon surrounded, first by angry locals, and then by 90 United States Marines under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Robert E. Lee. During the fight that followed, 9 of Brown's men were killed, a toll that included 2 of his sons. Brown himself was severely wounded by a sword thrust when the arsenal was stormed. He was captured and imprisoned to await trial for treason against the state of Virginia.
John Brown's attempted insurrection took place in Virginia, or part of Virginia, which is now West Virginia. So it was the state of Virginia that tried him for treason and for murder. In spite of its failure, the Harper's Ferry raid was proof to the Southerners that their precious institution, slavery, was now under violent attack from the North. And it was during his trial that John Brown self-consciously and I think quite effectively engineered his transformation from terrorist to martyr. In fact, he actually wrote to his wife and said that he knew he was going to hang and that he would be much more valuable hanged than acquitted. And he conducted his defense eloquently, masterfully. His mission, he argued, was not treason, was not insurrection. It was simply one thing: to free people, slaves. And if he had done the same thing for more powerful people, he would have been rewarded for it.
He also argued at his trial that he had not come to Virginia to start a slave uprising. He had come to free the slaves and then arm them for self-defense. Well, the court of Virginia saw that as distinction without difference. The court in Virginia, however, was also dealing with a great deal of mob pressure. Many Southerners, had they been given a chance, would have never even given John Brown a trial. They'd have simply strung him up from the nearest tree. So it didn't take long for the state of Virginia to find the infamous John Brown, remembering his activities in Kansas, guilty of fomenting a slave insurrection and murder, and sentenced him to hang.
And he used very Christ-like imagery as he described the mingling of his own blood with that of the millions of American slaves, which was crying out from the soil of America in some sort of shared martyrdom. So that when he was hanged, the crowds across the North did fall silent and the church bells did ring. And the Northern papers reported his execution as a crucifixion.
Within the month, John Brown was hanged, and with his death, the North had its first martyr, while the South had further proof of the North's true intent. Brown's prophetic words to his executioner still loom large in the pages of American history. I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will not be purged away but with blood. Even Brown could hardly have known that his name would soon be upon the lips of thousands of Northern soldiers as they prepared to do battle with their Southern foe. John Brown's body lies a-moldering in the grave, but his soul goes marching on. The pace of events was quickening, and the Southern states now talked openly of secession from the Union. They were a people who were fiercely protective of their way of life, proud of their strong economy, suspicious, fearful of change, and horrified at the thought of slave insurrection. But in truth, mere suspicion and mistrust of the North had by now been superseded by open hostility.
After John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry and other events that occurred around that time, such as what they call the riot in Christiana, Pennsylvania, where a Maryland slaveholder attempted to obtain his slaves using the fugitive slave law, the new fugitive slave law of 1850, and was killed in the process. Southerners saw a Northern conspiracy to destroy the institution of slavery, and therefore abused the property rights or the civil rights of Southerners.
Southerners, quite wrongly, linked John Brown with the new Republican Party, and they formed these militia bands all across the South in preparation for what they were sure would be a black Republican invasion in the wake of John Brown's insurrection. And they tarred and feathered Northerners that they found on Southern soil. They rid them out of town on a rail. They lynched some of them. They shut down Northern businesses and drove the proprietors back up to the North.
And this meant that as the politicians and as the opinion formers are getting closer and closer to an open break between North and South, at the individual level, in some of the more cosmopolitan towns in the South, there is individual violence that is an expression of sectional loyalty, Northern, or perhaps more important, Southern loyalty.
More significantly for what was to come, the South turned its back on the Democratic Party for not protecting slavery vociferously enough. The Southern membership split the party. They formed their own plank which explicitly promoted and protected slavery, and thereby left the Republicans with a divided opposition. So that even though Lincoln and the other Republican candidates didn't even appear on the ticket in like 10 Southern states, because the campaigners and the candidates would probably have been lynched if they'd shown up. Still, the Democrats were divided enough and in enough disarray to enable the Republicans basically to walk in 1860.
Although he polled less than 40% of the popular vote in 1860, the Republican Abraham Lincoln was elected President of the United States. The attempts by the new president to placate the South and to reassure it of its future were futile. And by the end of December 1860, South Carolina, always at the forefront of the secessionist cause, decided to leave the Union. Within weeks, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas had all followed its lead, and Jefferson Davis, a senator from Mississippi, had been elected by a convention of delegates gathered at Montgomery, Alabama, to be the first president of the Confederate States of America. Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, made a speech in Savannah, Georgia on March 21, 1861, that perfectly summed up the irreconcilable differences between what were now two nations.
The cornerstone of the Confederacy rests upon the truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery's subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition. This, our new government, is the first in history based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth.
Not all the southern states voted for secession. In fact, Virginia, soon to be a main theater of the Civil War, voted 2-1 against it, while Arkansas and Missouri both decided to remain within the Union. Some were so disinterested in the idea that they declined even to arrange conventions to debate the matter. The northern states watched on with a mixture of bewilderment and confusion. Clearly, something needed to be done to bring the errant South back into line, but what?
Once the Lower South seceded and formed the Confederacy, Northerners became very indignant. They were angry, extremely angry, that the Southerners would break away, secede, form their own country, and in essence dissolve the Union. In fact, Northern newspapers ran headlines saying the Union is dissolved. And to people who are proud of their country, this angered many Northerners. They saw it as an insult and couldn't believe that the South would dissolve the Union over the issue of slavery. In essence, they wanted to find some ways to reunify the country and welcome the prospects of war. They believed that Southern slaveholders and the slaveholding aristocracy, or as they called it, the slaveocracy, needed to be taught a very valuable lesson.
In addition to the clear clash of ideologies, there were also practical considerations, not the least of which were the 2 federal garrisons that were positioned in Confederate states. What was to be done about Fort Pickens at Pensacola, Florida, and Fort Sumter, which lay in Charleston Harbor? The Star of the West, a merchant Navy ship, had already tried to deliver supplies to the Sumter garrison during January 1861. But shell fire from shore batteries, manned by cadets from the Military College of South Carolina, had forced them to return home with their cargo undelivered. Feelings in both the North and South were running high, and their positions became more intractable and more polarized with every passing day. Fort Sumter, in particular, began to take on great symbolic significance. For the South, it was an affront to have a federal military installation in the very heart of the Confederacy. South Carolina had, after all, been the first state to secede. For the North, the prospect of abandoning the fort voluntarily was unthinkable. And so Lincoln made a fateful decision. The garrison would be relieved under the strictest orders that it should use force only if it came under fire from the South Carolinians, as the previous relief expedition had done. Lincoln was determined to absolve himself of any responsibility for firing the first shot in any armed showdown. By now, however, a political solution to the showdown was nigh on impossible, although several attempts to reach a compromise were tried. The game of brinkmanship was about to end. The South had accepted that only the bullet and the cannon shell would settle the matter. It was a view probably widely held by many in the North. With the Northern Relief Convoy due to arrive on April the 11th, the Confederates demanded the surrender of Fort Sumter. On April 10th, Major Robert Anderson, the federal commander, refused. But the garrison had only a few days' worth of supplies remaining, as few as 3 or 4 days, according to Confederate reckoning. What if the relief expedition was some kind of federal trick? The Confederate commanders asked themselves, why wait until it arrived and take the chance? So it was that at 4:30 a.m. on April 12, 1861, Confederate forces began the bombardment of the federal garrison at Fort Sumter, and the first shots of the American Civil War were fired.
The first shot of the Civil War was fired by a white-haired old fiery Virginia secessionist named Edmund Ruffin. He was 67 years old, long white hair down to here. And he felt that the first shot of the Confederacy should be a shot of honor, and he was going to fire it. In Fort Sumter, Anderson's second in command was Abner Doubleday. Doubleday was lying in bed in his quarters in Fort Sumter, and about 4:30 in the morning, Ruffin's first shot crashes into the fort and buries itself in the wall about 2 feet above Doubleday's head. So I think Doubleday probably stayed in bed for a little while longer. Certainly, the Federals didn't even begin returning the Confederate fire for another 2 hours. But they were completely outgunned. They had no mortars in the fort. They had no fuses for their cannons. And meanwhile, the Confederate fire had just been building and building and building.
One of the Confederate gunners, a gentleman by the name of Daniel Howe, while he was loading the gun, one of the men had not swabbed the barrel down properly, and as a result, there was a flame in the cannon. So the gun went off prematurely, ripped off his arm, and he was dead within moments. He was the first casualty of the American Civil War. After that, the casualties were few and far between. None of the soldiers, Northern soldiers in the fort, were harmed. The fort was reduced to rubble.
In all, Fort Sumter took more than 600 direct hits during the 34-hour artillery bombardment. No federal soldier was killed or even seriously hurt. The fort itself, though, took a battering. Realizing the hopelessness of the garrison's position, Anderson surrendered Fort Sumter on April 13th, and he and his men were allowed to leave aboard the ships of the Federal Relief Expedition. The Federal commander, a Southerner by birth, took with him the tattered and torn Union flag that had proudly and defiantly overlooked the Confederate town of Charleston only a few hours previously.
Incredibly enough, there were only 4 Union casualties from the bombardment, all of them wounded, and the only death occurred after Fort Sumter surrendered. As the Union garrison was leaving on April 14th, Major Anderson received permission to fire a salute to the flag. And it was during that exercise that one of the cannons exploded and killed one of the gunners. So the only death occurring as a result of bombardment of Fort Sumter actually occurred after the surrender, after the fact.
The bombardment and surrender of Fort Sumter provides the clear military casus belli that makes the Civil War into a war. There had to be some trigger, the shot heard round the world for this war. And Fort Sumter provides that trigger.
For months, even years, the pressure had been building, and the tension had been rising, but the events at Fort Sumter put an end to all the uncertainty. Maybe it was a relief for both sides to have finally reached a position that all understood. This was war, and to the victor would go the spoils. Now President Lincoln had no recourse but to use armed force. While he called for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion, the states of the Upper South seceded from the Union, meaning that the Confederacy was able to welcome the arrival of North Carolina, Tennessee, Arkansas, and Virginia. Meanwhile, the North was quickly engulfed by a wave of patriotic fervor, and thousands of volunteers flocked to the colors to put an end to the rebellion in the South. What would the men who raced to join the ranks have thought had they known what lay in store for them? Not the short, sharp, glorious winner-take-all battle that would decide the war in one dramatic thrust, but 4 miserable years of carnage and bloodshed. Had any man on either side been able to foresee what lay ahead, would the course of events have been any different? As the drums of war beat ever louder, it is difficult to believe they would.
There can be no neutrals in this war, only patriots or traitors.
Whatever may have been my political opinions before, I have but one sentiment now. That is, we have a government, and laws, and a flag, and they must all be sustained.
So impatient did I become, for starting, that I felt like 1,000 pins were pricking me in every part of my body. And I started off a week in advance of my brothers.
The streets of Charleston are crowded with armed men, singing, and promenading men, the battle blood running through their veins, that oxygen which is called the flush of victory on their cheeks. The dramatic events at Fort Sumter in South Carolina in April 1861 finally put an end to the political posturing of the federal government and the newly formed Southern Confederacy. With the surrender of the United States fort, any small hope of a peaceful resolution of the deep-seated ideological differences that existed between the two sides had gone. The new currency was the bullet, the bayonet, and the cannon shell. It seemed that men and women from each side understood that their fate had been wrenched from the grasp of the politicians and placed into the hands of the soldiers that wore the blue of the Union forces and the gray and butternut of the Confederate Army. And so America prepared to go to war, not with a foreign foe, but with itself. At stake were not just the ways of life of the North and the South, but the very future of the United States.
Dear brother, they are volunteering right smartly here. If you want to join a company, come down here and let's go together.
I have the best suit of clothes that ever I had in my life. War? I can't sleep. I can't study. I don't know as I can write.
If a fellow wants to go with a girl now, he'd better enlist.
People in the South had a view of war based on the Victorian chivalric romance rather than on modern industrial reality.
The outbreak of war, in effect, led to a wave of Southern nationalism, of Southern patriotism, and young men flocked to the recruiting offices to fill the ranks of local militias and the Confederate Army.
The people of the South felt that they had been aggrieved enough by what they perceived to be the abolitionist North, and now they had seceded and formed their own sovereign nation.
And they would not for a moment have considered that they were going into a modern 19th century industrialized war in which having things like shipyards and foundries and steel mills would have made a difference. Having railways of one gauge would be an advantage. It doesn't occur to people in the South that they're going into a 5-year meat grinder of a war. And as a result, the South goes to war with a romantic ideal as their paradigm of what war is all about. And it is a false paradigm.
I think there was a lot of indignation in the North, and again, anger, similar to when the states of the Deep South seceded. How dare they secede? How dare they fire on the flag of the United States? And I believe the firing on Fort Sumter gave even those people in the North who were ambivalent about secession, it gave them sort of something to rally around, gave them something to look to and say, look, not only did they secede, not only did they destroy our Union, but now they've fired on our soldiers.
It was viewed as treason against the United States. It was viewed as rebellion. It was viewed as heresy against the civic religion of America.
And this anger led to a rise of Northern patriotism, of unionism. Northern men then rushed to their recruiting stations to fill the ranks of local militias, to join the Union Army.
That meant that the North could not imagine a peaceful solution to this. Treason is punishable by death in the common imagination. And as a result, it was blood and war that would rectify the situation.
It must have been with some relief that North Carolina, Virginia, Tennessee, and Arkansas were welcomed into the Confederate fold, since these 4 states were to provide the Confederate Army with half its food and almost a third of its men. Virginia was also strategically important to the South, lying as it did across the Potomac, close to Washington, the federal capital. However, many citizens of Western Virginia were not crazy about the idea of secession from the federal government. In fact, that part of Virginia sent thousands of men to serve in the Union Army. In 1863, the western half of the state would itself secede from Virginia, giving birth to the new state of Western Virginia. Likewise, some men from eastern Tennessee formed their own regiments to serve in the Union Army. Another crucial state was Maryland.
Sea communications between Washington and New York or Boston or Philadelphia are controlled by Maryland. You've got to go through Maryland or Virginia to get to the sea. And that means that Abe Lincoln could not afford to lose Maryland to the Confederacy. And what Abe Lincoln does is he packs Maryland with so many northern militiamen so many federal soldiers that there is no physical way that Maryland can join the Confederacy. Even if the Maryland legislature votes to secede, they cannot physically leave the Union. And Maryland bows to that reality, and Maryland stays within the Union as a, for the moment, slave-owning state within the United States.
Not all Southerners were gripped by secessionist fervor. Many people found themselves wrestling with the terrible dilemma of giving their loyalty to their country or their state. One soldier in the Union Army who agonized over this question was a certain Robert E. Lee, a man who would play a central role as the drama of the Civil War unfolded. Never a keen secessionist, Lee was actually offered command of all the Union forces, but his loyalty to his native Virginia, against which he famously said he could not raise his sword, persuaded him that his rightful place lay with the Confederate Army.
Many of the best officers of the United States Army were Southern, including Robert E. Lee, and they resigned their commissions and went south. And even the Confederate President, Jefferson Davis, was a very experienced soldier from the Mexican War days, and he was a former Secretary of War for the United States. Compare that with the Northern Commander-in-Chief, Abraham Lincoln, whose entire military experience consisted of, I think, 80 days as the captain of some jackleg regiment out in the frontier in Illinois during the Black Hawk Indian Wars. And as he said, he didn't see any fighting. He spent most of that time swatting mosquitoes and running away from the Indians.
At least the federal government had the framework to expand the size of the regular army and then create a very, very large volunteer force. They had the infrastructure, they had the bureaucratic system in Washington to enable them to do this. The Confederate government had to start from scratch. They had none of this.
The way they went about raising their armies they both relied heavily on the militias, but they opened up recruiting offices and offered bounties to men who would join their armies for a certain amount of days, realizing that men aren't going to join for a year to 4 years as they would in the regular army, that they needed to get citizen soldiers who would join for 90 days, because the common belief, believe it or not, was that the war would only take 3 months. Each side believed that they would be able to whip the other one in quick, decisive battles, and that this would be a short-lived war. So therefore, they recruiters signed up men for 90 days, and the states offered bounties. In this way, you had men running to the recruiters, realizing that they could leave the farm and come back in time to either harvest the crops or save the farm from disaster. They wouldn't be away from their loved ones long. And since each thought they would be a part of the superior and victorious army, they believed they'd come home to the adulation of loved ones and the cheers of their nation.
Perhaps it was the overall aims of both sides that had the greatest effect on military thinking. The South was about to fight a defensive war because, as Jefferson Davis had said, it merely wished to be left alone to live its life. There was no need to conquer the North to win. What the South needed to do most of all was to prevent a conquest by the North. It was very different for the Federal Army. The South would have to be subdued for victory to be won. The North entered the war with vastly superior manpower and manufacturing capabilities than its foe, but would the same fervor drive its army forward? It was not, after all, fighting for its very life, but to maintain the Union. There were even those who argued that the North should not go to war at all, and that the South, which was not self-sufficient, could be defeated merely by mounting effective blockades. The Northern public were calling for a quick and decisive victory, a single glorious triumph that would put the upstart South in its place and teach it a lesson. Forward to Richmond was the cry from some sections of the Northern press, for whom revenge for Fort Sumter was the minimum requirement. It was in May 1861 that the first notable casualty of the war came. Elmer E. Ellsworth was a colonel in the Union Army, an attorney by profession, and a personal friend of Abraham Lincoln. He was shot and killed by the keeper of a hotel in Alexandria, Virginia, as he tried to remove a Confederate flag from its roof. His death gave the North, briefly, another martyr. And so the pace quickened still further, until on a roasting July day in 1861, the Union and Confederate armies finally got their opportunity to face each other on the battlefield. To the soldiers of the South, the battle was called Manassas, but in the North, it was known as Bull Run.
The first 3 months after Fort Sumter were really a strange time for both armies. I mean, these two nations were supposedly at war, yet no battles had been fought. So both armies were really in limbo. And the first thing for both sides was the protection of their capital cities. And this was especially important for the South, since they'd moved their capital north from Montgomery to Richmond. And so this place, Manassas, is about 75 miles north of Richmond, and it was strategically very important. I mean, two major railroads met there at Manassas Junction, and there was a set of roads leading out into all directions. So this was the place where the Confederates deployed their first troops in order to protect their capital and also to secure this strategic location.
Both sides believe that their two armies are going to approach each other and fight a grand, decisive battle that will go largely according to the plans of the commanders. In reality, none of this happens. So everybody goes out thinking that there's going to be a grand Napoleonic battle. And just as French people did for the Battle of Sedan in 1870, not long after, spectators came out to watch. They assumed that it would be a Napoleonic-style battle held on a battlefield between armies with no involvement of non-combatants. Well, why not go out and watch? And the result was that when nothing goes according to plan, the spectators are caught up in the Union retreat, and some congressmen, including one from Rochester, New York, are captured. Bull Run, Manassas, the first battle there, goes according to plan for nobody in any possible way. Bull Run was an eye-opener and a surprise to everyone involved.
When the fighting began, there was early success for the Federal forces. At 9:30 a.m., General McDowell ordered his Army of Northeastern Virginia across the Bull Run stream, and they smashed into the Confederate positions. One by one, the Confederate lines began to crumble, and men began to flee, much to the joy of the Union soldiers, some of whom could be heard crying that the South was beaten and the war was over. However, they had not reckoned on the brigade at the center of the Confederate positions, commanded by the Virginian Thomas Jackson. These troops had recently arrived from General Joseph E. Johnson's Army of the Shenandoah, and they refused to give way, holding firm against the Union attacks. "Look, men, there is Jackson, standing like a stone wall," cried General B. of South Carolina, as his own troops faltered in the face of the oncoming Federal troops. A turning point in the battle had been reached, and the legend of Stonewall Jackson was born. Suddenly, the Federal tide was stemmed, and the fighting began to ebb and flow across the battlefield. Then more Confederate forces under the command of General Joe Johnson began to appear, and the arrival of these new, fresh troops had a dramatic effect on the exhausted, hungry, and thirsty Union soldiers. It was 4 in the afternoon. Sensing that the moment had come, General Beauregard organized a huge Confederate attack on the Union lines, and the Southern troops swarmed forward. Incredibly, given the events of the morning, the Federal lines broke, and the Northern troops were soon in full retreat. The panic-stricken rout became known later in the North as the Great Skedaddle. The Southern Army that had been a whisker from defeat had now won total victory, and Washington, the capital of the Union, lay undefended before them.
In light of the disorderly retreat of the Northern Army at the Battle of Manassas, a lot of people are surprised that the Southern Army did not push on and capture Washington. But this is the first battle. You're dealing with amateur troops, and you're dealing with a Southern Confederacy that whose strategy is more to wage a war of attrition, in which they would force the the Federal Army to bleed itself and sue for, and then allow the Southerners to sue for peace, than to actually wage an offensive war to capture Washington.
This was not to be seen as a war of Southern aggression. All we want is to be left alone. Those were his words, and that's what he wanted the world to believe. But also, I think First Bull Run Manassas was such a muddle, such a mess, that it took quite a while for even the Confederate commanders to realize that they gained the victory. I think at one point Jefferson Davis actually rode up on horseback from the rear, and he looked around and he couldn't tell whether he was looking at victory or defeat. And one of the Confederate generals there, Joe Johnston, later said that the Southern forces seemed to be more disorganized by their victory than the Federals were by their defeat.
Bull Run First Manassas had seen 4,500 men killed, seriously wounded, or taken prisoner from both sides. But as the fighting wore on, even these figures would pale when compared to the casualties at battles such as Shiloh, Antietam, Gettysburg, and Fredericksburg. The events of July 1861 gave the politicians, the military, and the public a severe jolt. The war was obviously not going to be won or lost in a day. It was going to be a long, hard road. The South was rocked by disagreements between those within the military that urged that the Southern Army attack Washington without delay, and the more cautious voices that were being heard in Richmond. In the North, General McDowell paid the price for the disaster at Manassas when the popular George B. McClellan replaced him.
In 1861, the Coastal War also begins to take shape. The Union Navy, which is growing larger by the month, will begin to blockade the southern coast, and along the Gulf Coast and then up the Mississippi River. This is the Union Navy applying pressure, squeezing the life out of the Confederacy, while Union armies begin to apply pressure at different points.
Lincoln's blockade at the South got off to a shaky start. It was porous, and there were many blockade runners, merchant ships that were getting through fairly easily. So many people, particularly in Europe, were calling it the paper blockade. You know, it worked well on paper, but it wasn't actually working well at sea. Now, towards the end of 1861, the Federal Navy was able to secure some important coastal ports like Hatteras in North Carolina and Ship Island in the Gulf, Port Royal in South Carolina, and some others. So they were able to strengthen the blockade towards the end of 1861. But the blockade was also sending mixed signals politically, and especially to the one power that both Lincoln and Davis desperately wanted to court, and that was Great Britain. And the problem was this, that in order to forestall European recognition of the Confederacy, Lincoln maintained from the beginning that this was not a war between two powers. It was merely a domestic insurrection to be put down locally. It was a purely internal affair. And so a number of prominent people in Europe, particularly Britain, were saying, well, all right, if this is just a domestic insurrection, a local affair, then what in the world is the President of the United States doing blockading his own people? That's an act of barbarity. And they argued that if Lincoln wanted them to respect the blockade as a legitimate war measure under international maritime law, then he in turn would have to admit that the Confederacy was in fact a legitimate belligerent power with all the rights that are due to them from other neutral nations at war. So in effect, the blockade was giving the Confederacy more legitimacy than Lincoln actually wanted them to have.
During the early weeks and months of 1862, the thoughts of both sides turned more sharply to the prosecution of the war at sea. The fact was that in the mid-19th century, America was far from being a naval power. When war came, the Federal and Confederate navies were as chronically unprepared as their armies, and the race for supremacy of the seas soon began. It was a huge task. One thing, though, was abundantly clear to all. The old wooden ships could not hope to withstand a bombardment from the new artillery shells.
Throughout the 19th century, guns get more accurate, guns get more powerful, and are quicker to reload, relay, and fire. And that means that ships have got to deal with other ships and with shore batteries that have got stronger and stronger guns in them.
The Confederates develop an ironclad ship, the Confederate States ship Virginia, which was built on the hull of the old USS Merrimack.
And it's got guns poking out of gun ports all along its sides and fore and aft, and it's got a ram in it because 19th century Americans were tremendous classicists, and they loved the idea of reviving the classical ram. And they're going to use this to break the Union blockade.
This thing steamed out of Hampton Roads and immediately began to engage the wooden Union warships that were protecting the supply ships and other vessels that were supplying George McClellan's army. And the Virginia immediately begins to sink and set fire to some of these ships.
It was not a seaworthy vessel. It was a barge. It could barely move. It sailed like a pig, but it had a lot of guns, and it was covered with iron.
Luckily for the United States Navy and for the U.S. Army operating the peninsula, naval experts had thought about this earlier, and they came up with their own contraption. It was the brainchild of a Swedish inventor by the name of John Ericsson. It was called the USS Monitor.
The Monitor put its guns in a rotating turret, which was new. It had almost no freeboard. That is, it didn't stick out above the water much, which was new. All the accommodation and running gear and everything was below decks and below the water line, which was new. It was the first, perhaps, the first modern warship.
USS Monitor's mission was limited to one thing: protect the Union fleet in Hampton Roads, and that it did well. It fought the CSS Virginia to a standstill. The Virginia went back into port and never to be seen in active operations again.
These two concepts, the southern idea of taking a lot of thick sheet metal and thick rails, actually, bolting it onto the outside of a ship and using it as a gun barge, and the northern idea of completely radicalizing naval design, both come from the different bases that the North and the South had to work on. The North could start with a new engineering concept. They could build a new hull. They could build a new engine. They could build a rotating turret. The North could do all these things because the North had an industrial base. They had more than one steel mill, more than one shipyard. They had engineers who had practiced naval architecture in the North for years. What did the South have? The South had one steel mill. They had almost a shipyard. At any one time, the Confederacy can take its entire steel output and build an almost useful pig of a ship. And in the long term, that means that however good their captains are, and however heavily gunned these barges are, the Confederacy cannot beat the Union Navy at sea.
Despite the drama of the clashes on the southern coastline, the main focus of the war during the early months of 1862 was still, of course, the battle on land. For the North, still smarting from the events of the previous summer, there was at last some good tidings when news came of the capture of Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, two major Confederate positions in Tennessee. The architect of these victories was Ulysses S. Grant, a man who was destined to cast a long shadow over the remainder of the war. "Nothing except unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted," he told the Confederate commander at Donelson, and another Civil War legend was given life. Unconditional Surrender Grant was promoted to Major General, and the Northern press had a new, if unlikely, hero.
Now, the South went into deep shock and mourning when the first of their state capitals was evacuated, and the Union despair at Bull Run, Manassas was transformed overnight into giddy elation. Plus, these momentous Union victories, which gained the North such extensive southern territory and control, sent a very sobering signal to any European powers considering intervening on the side of the Confederacy.
The scene was now set for one of the bloodiest episodes of the entire war. It came on April 6, 1862, a beautiful Sunday morning along the banks of the Tennessee River in southwestern Tennessee. The place was near Shiloh Church. In Hebrew, it means tranquility. Never can a place have been given such an inappropriate name.
God grant that I may never see such scenes again.
Their cannonade was like a mighty hurricane sweeping all before it.
The Battle of Shiloh, which was called the Battle of Pittsburgh Landing in the North, was the bloodiest battle of the war to point. It pitted two huge armies against each other. Both of these armies were relatively green, though, especially the Confederate Army, which was under the command of General Albert Sidney Johnston. The battle began early in the morning. The Union forces literally were caught basically just getting out of their tents as they're fixing breakfast. They should have known that the Confederates were getting ready to attack.
And Grant was just stunned. He didn't expect so soon after his victories at Fort Henry and Donelson to have to face this onslaught of 40,000 Confederate troops.
But an attack does come, and the first day of the Battle of Shiloh goes totally against the Union forces. At the battle of what's called the Battle of the Hornet's Nest, a Union brigade gets surrounded. Confederate artillery is brought up, and they blast the Union defenders almost at point-blank range. The Union brigade that fights there, though, is able to buy time for the Union Army to regroup. Luckily, nightfall sets in, and luckily for U.S. Grant, who's back at Pittsburgh Landing on the Tennessee River, luckily for him, Union reinforcements begin to arrive during the night. They're shuttled across the river by the Union Navy, and he is able to launch a massive counterattack the next day and is able to get back all of the ground that he had lost from the previous day and force the Confederates to evacuate the field. So although Shiloh is a near-run thing, it is still a pretty clear-cut victory for the North and another laurel for U.S. Grant to put in his hat. But the cost was staggering. Tens of thousands of casualties on both sides. The field was literally crawling with wounded men. The bloodiest battle that any U.S. Army, any army that the United States or the Confederate States could field up to that time. It's the bloodiest battle they ever fought in. But more was yet to come.
The suffering of the poor wounded on both sides during the wild night of April 6th and 7th is hard to comprehend. As the surgeons worked like fury, piles of bloody amputated limbs began to form, horrific testimonies to the ferocity of the fighting. It was said that wild pigs from the surrounding woods feasted on the bodies of the dead and dying. Battle was rejoined the following morning, but now 25,000 reinforcements had arrived to bolster the Union side, and the Confederate Army's attacks were repulsed. By the afternoon of Monday, April 7th, they were in full retreat, and a long line of beaten and battered Southern soldiers stretched some 7 miles back towards the town of Corinth. Perhaps the Federal troops should have given chase, but they were simply too exhausted and disorganized. Nearly 4,000 dead men littered the battlefield at Shiloh. 2,000 more were mortally wounded. The bloodbath had been the worst of the war by far, and the endless lists of dead and wounded came as a horrible shock to both sides.
Overall, and in spite of the ambiguity of that battle, all the attrition, all the bloodletting, the military position for the North was strengthened. Shiloh consolidated the northern victories at Fort Donelson and Fort Henry, and it hit Confederate morale and let the Federals know that for the most part, they were the ones who'd be in charge of the Western theater.
If the defeat at Shiloh had been a setback for the Confederacy in the West, more bad news came from the Deep South. As a result of a brilliant tactical maneuver by Federal ships under the command of Flag Officer David G. Farragut, New Orleans, the largest city in the Confederacy, had fallen without a shot being fired. What was more, and just as bad, Baton Rouge had also surrendered, as had Natchez, Mississippi. Only in the Eastern Theater did things look a little better for the South. But in the early spring of 1862, even the situation there was bleak. Luckily for the South, Lincoln and McClellan could not agree on Union strategy. And in the Shenandoah Valley, Stonewall Jackson's inspired and brilliant leadership was making him a hero to the people of the South.
We've received some mixed images of Jackson down through the years, which really indicate how complex a figure he was. I think first, and perhaps most frivolously, you've got Jackson the eccentric, the goofball, the one who his own troops call Crazy Tom.
He did things which are downright weird. He was convinced that if he didn't hold one arm up in the air all the time, all the blood would pool in it, and he would therefore sit around with one arm in the air all the time.
This is the Jackson who won't eat pepper because it makes his left leg hurt. The one who's always sucking on lemons in order to cure his sour stomach. Perhaps this is the Jackson who seems to have a direct line to God, like John Brown said he had, so he gets divine inspiration for his military strategies. And then I think most importantly, you've got the military strategist, the military professor, which he was.
He was a stern taskmaster and a risk taker. His ability to march his troops over long distances in a short amount of time earned him a lot of accolade. In fact, his unit was called Jackson's Foot Cavalry. He was not afraid to fight, and he wasn't afraid to take a risk. And therefore, his tactics and strategies are in line with those of his commander, General Robert E. Lee.
He was an absolutely useless lecturer in military science, but a brilliant practitioner of military science. He suddenly became almost a textbook military genius.
While the Jackson legend continued to grow, McClellan's cautious progress on the Virginia Peninsula was earning him the nickname the Virginia Creeper. Lincoln had become angry and frustrated by the slow speed of the Union advance towards the Confederate capital of Richmond. Although, to be fair to McClellan, terrible weather was hindering the movement of the Union troops. Less understandable, perhaps, was the constant suspicion of the Union commander that his enemy outnumbered him. Eventually, McClellan's troops pushed on to within 5 miles of the Confederate capital. Inside the city, there was chaos as the people feared the worst. Even Jefferson Davis's government prepared to pack up and leave. It fell to Joe Johnson to march his men south of the Chickahominy River, where they fought a savage 2-day battle at Fair Oaks. In the South, the battle was known as Seven Pines, and it cost the Southern Army 6,000 casualties, one of whom was Johnson himself, who received serious wounds. The North, meanwhile, suffered the loss of 5,000 men, and McClellan pleaded with Lincoln for reinforcements that were not forthcoming. The Battle of Fair Oaks was inconclusive, and it left Davis without a commander for the defense of Richmond. It did not seem so at the time, but the Confederate president's appointment of his senior military advisor, Robert E. Lee, as replacement for the wounded Johnson was something of a masterstroke.
Well, Robert E. Lee certainly is considered one of the greatest generals in American history. Lee was a very well-respected man in both armies. But I think one of the reasons why Lee is held in such high regard among military historians today is because of his great leadership qualities, his willingness to take calculated risks, his willingness to lead from the front if need be, and also because of his great character and morality.
Lee was soon on the counterattack, starting at Mechanicsville on June 26th, on a campaign that was to become known as the 7 Days.
To put it into perspective, it is necessary to understand the leader, the general-in-chief of the Northern Army. McClellan was a West Pointer, like many of them, and he was well-versed in tactics and a good disciplinarian. And in fact, he whipped the Army of the Potomac into a good professional fighting force. They looked beautiful, they drilled well, and they were prepared for battle. However, as time went on, McClellan, who was initially arrogant and overconfident, became frightened. He was afraid to go into battle. He was afraid of what would happen if he lost. He was so overconfident that he was afraid of losing at this point. Finally, Lincoln started to push him. He threatened to remove him if he didn't make a move, to just cross the river and attack the Confederates. Well, McClellan came up with a plan. He would enter Richmond. Instead of attacking the army, he would capture Richmond by going up the Potomac and entering Richmond through the back. He'd go down the York Rivers. And so, in doing so, he'd come into Richmond through the back door. Detecting this move and the possibility of other movements, Robert E. Lee called his forces in around Richmond to protect Richmond. When McClellan arrives, he encounters a Confederate force which he overestimates in size. He acts too cautiously, and throughout this campaign, he doesn't throw his full weight against Richmond. Likewise, Lee and his commanders are afraid that the Union forces would be able to overwhelm them and break through. What will occur next is that he finally, after several losses, which aren't that decisive, I mean, he almost overwhelms the Confederate forces at several times, Gaines Mills and Fair Oaks, but he begins to pull back towards Harrison's Landing, where the Navy can protect him. At that point, Lee and his forces began to take the offensive, sensing his fear. Like an animal, they attack. At this point, he starts to pull back, and the campaign is over. Richmond is safe. McClellan has failed. Failed not because he didn't have the resources. He failed because of fear.
The 7 Days campaign saw yet more terrible bloodshed and appalling losses on both sides. More than 30,000 men were killed, wounded, or captured. The bloody battles of the previous 3 months had brought another unwelcome dimension to the fighting, that of the need for revenge. Both the Union and Confederate armies had now suffered defeats and reverses that needed to be avenged, and as a result, the prospect of peace disappeared even further into the distance. The war was now more than a year old, and the North and the South were staring into an abyss.
In order for the Confederacy to stop what is starting to look more and more like a Union steamroller, very well provided for, very well fed, very well armed, that is rolling southwards along the line of the Orange and Alexandria Railway, Lee needs to force the Union to defend itself. And at the Second Battle of Bull Run, Second Manassas. What Lee and Jackson succeed in doing is forcing the Union onto the defensive by attacking their supply lines, by going for the key Manassas Junction supply depot.
There were 7 days of fighting in and around Bull Run, and at the end of it, and for the first time in the war, it's the Confederates who are poised as the invading army. John Pope and his troops fought a rearguard action all the way back to Washington, near about. So this meant that with an army half the size of the combined Northern forces, Robert E. Lee was able to push that war right back to Lincoln's doorstep, to within 20 miles of Washington.
In September 1862, the spotlight was once more turned onto the state of Maryland. Lee, as bold as ever, was determined to follow up on the victory at Second Manassas by taking the war to the front porch of the Union. And there was genuine hope now on the southern side, rising mainly from what appeared to be the crumbling state of the Union. Disagreements and divisions, both military and political, an upcoming election that the Republicans were far from certain of winning, all combined to convince the Confederate Army that one last push might bring the entire shaky northern edifice crashing down. So it was that on September 14, 1862, 50,000 troops of the Army of Northern Virginia crossed the Potomac River into Maryland. They were a mere 30 miles from Washington, and this time it was the federal capital that was thrown into a panic.
Politically, an invasion of the North might just tip the balance enough to bring along European recognition of the Confederacy, which was still being withheld. And also, I think most importantly, as Lee himself proposed to Jefferson Davis, an invasion of the North would enable the Confederacy to hold out an olive branch from a position of strength without making it seem like an act of Southern aggression. The idea was to encourage the Northern anti-war faction to boot Lincoln and the Republicans out of office and to elect a peace faction which would agree to an amicable separation rather than to prolong the war.
And the only way to do this was to invade Maryland. And he sought to do this in 1862 at a place called Antietam. Now, the battlefield wasn't at his choosing, but his plans were discovered by federal troops, a federal patrol. They found a package on the ground, a package carelessly left by a Confederate officer. And this package contained 3 cigars wrapped in the secret orders, in Lee's secret orders. And when they opened up the package, took out the cigars, and read the orders, they could return them. And federal officers knew exactly where and what Lee was doing, and they were prepared for him.
At 6 a.m. on September 17, 1862, federal forces hurled themselves upon the Confederate left flank, attacking Stonewall Jackson's troops through a cornfield that stood between them and their objective. Amid scenes of the most shocking carnage, it seemed that the Union troops were about to take their objective, but a frantic counterattack by General John Bell Hood's division drove them back into the cornfield. 15 times in 4 hours, the cornfield changed hands. 8,000 men fell trying to secure it for their side. As the fighting raged on the Confederate left flank, a bitter struggle was also developing in its center. Here was a natural sunken road, a fine defensive position for the Southern troops, and a place that was to earn the chilling epithet, Bloody Lane.
Best way to characterize this fighting, it's a stand-up, knockdown, bloody fight. Union brigades will be brought up. They will be brought directly in front of the Confederates, defending the lane, and they will stand there and just slug it out with the Confederate forces. Confederates, of course, have an advantage in that they are being protected from this natural breastwork of the sunken lane. They've knocked down the Virginia snake rail fences that run along the length of the lane, and they're using that as breastworks too. But the Union forces are coming in on higher ground. And eventually, and because they have more forces, they will envelop the Confederate flanks, and because of that higher position, will force the Confederates to eventually retreat. As the Union forces pursue the vanquished Confederates, they will cross through this lane, which is littered with hundreds of dead and wounded Confederate soldiers. So many that most first-person accounts say that you could walk from one end of the lane to the other without stepping on the ground, just by stepping on the bodies of the dead and the wounded.
Meanwhile, on the Confederate right flank, 500 Southern troops dug in on high ground were holding back 12,500 Union troops under General Ambrose Burnside as they tried to take a stone bridge over Antietam Creek. Despite heavy losses, they eventually managed to scatter the Southern troops. But as the victorious Yankees pushed on and were about to envelop the Confederate line, reinforcements in the shape of the Confederate Light Division under A.P. Hill arrived to rip into the left flank of Burnside's men. True to form, McClellan refused to run the risk of sending reinforcements to aid Burnside, informing his desperate comrade that it would not be prudent. September 17, 1862, would go down as the single bloodiest day in American history. 8,000 men had been killed or mortally wounded. 15,000 more received severe wounds. Lee's battered army was forced back across the Potomac, thus ending the threat to Washington. McClellan now had the opportunity to press home the advantage by pursuing the exhausted Southern army across the river. But even a personal visit from Abraham Lincoln was not enough to convince the Northern commander of the need for swift and decisive action.
George McClellan is a very cautious, deliberate commander. And even when he is on the offensive, even when he's got the enemy on the run, it is not in him to pursue. McClellan views his army as being the last reserve of the last army of the Republic. That's why he doesn't press his advantage at Antietam, and that's why he doesn't pursue Robert E. Lee.
As battered and beaten as Lee's army was after the Battle of Antietam, the Army of the Potomac under McClellan was just as battered. And you have to keep in mind that this army was a relatively new organization. It was the old Army of the Potomac from the Peninsula Campaign, combined with the Army of Virginia after Second Manassas. In addition, new regiments were filtering into the Army, regiments that are being recruited in the summer of 1862. In addition, there were quite a few losses in general officers during this campaign. One general at South Mountain was killed. A Corps commander, General Joseph Mansfield, was killed on September 17th. Another Corps commander, General Joseph Hooker, was seriously wounded during the fight of the Cornfield. General Israel Richardson, a division commander in the Second Corps, is mortally wounded. And so the losses of these general officers, plus the general losses among the men, the many losses among the men, the new staffs, the new organization, and a less than aggressive general in the likes of George McClellan, all these factors combined. Plus, don't forget, McClellan the whole time thinks that Robert E. Lee outnumbers him. Otherwise, why would he have divided his forces early in the campaign? Why would he have undertaken this invasion of Northern Territory? So all that combined will prevent George McClellan from being audacious and aggressively pursuing Lee.
For Lincoln, the lost opportunity that had been purchased at such a high price at Antietam was the final straw. Now certain that McClellan was not up to the job, after he made countless excuses for not aggressively pursuing his beaten foe, Lincoln relieved the Northern commander of his duties on November 7th. On September 22nd, just 5 days after the bloodbath at Antietam, President Lincoln issued his Emancipation Proclamation, which declared that from January 1863, all slaves in states still engaged in rebellion against the Union would be free. The proclamation stopped short of abolishing slavery altogether, as many had hoped. Others cynically questioned the practical value of legislation that promised change in areas not controlled by federal forces.
The Emancipation Proclamation, or some call it the Preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, was issued September 22nd, 1862. And what the proclamation states is that any state that is still in rebellion as of January 1st, 1863, will lose its slaves. In other words, Lincoln, as commander-in-chief of the armies, will emancipate the slaves in those states that are still in rebellion as of January 1st, 1863. This serves a diplomatic purpose because England cannot recognize the slaveholding Confederacy in a war for emancipation. And this makes emancipation a war aim of the North. Likewise, what it says to the Confederacy, if you give up, if the state comes back to us now, slavery will be protected. And they have an example of that. Maryland in 1862 is still a slave state, bordering on Washington, D.C., and those fugitive slaves that run from Maryland are promptly returned to their slaveholders. Now, there's a third aspect of this Emancipation Proclamation which will change the United States military and the United States forever. It allows, as of January 1st, 1863, the enlistment of African Americans into the United States Army. And they will heed that call. Over 175,000 will serve in Uncle Sam's Army for the cause of freedom.
If Shiloh had given the entire country a rude awakening, Antietam came as a further shock to both the North and the South. President Jefferson Davis's popularity, which had never been particularly high, plunged to new depths, and the military and political differences between the leaders of the Confederacy began to widen. Conscription, introduced in 1862, was a deeply unpopular policy, and it is thought that nearly half of those men in the South who were drafted ignored or avoided the call. To add to the grim mood, the shortages brought about by the Union blockade began to bite and prices soared. Travel within the Confederate States became a virtual impossibility, not least because miles of railroad track had been torn up. In the North, the Emancipation Proclamation was not popular, and the high casualties from the summer and fall campaigns cast a gloom over the Northern public. In addition, Northern state governments also began drafting men into the military. McClellan's replacement as commander of the Army of the Potomac was General Ambrose Burnside, the man who had been in command of the Union left flank at Antietam Creek. As overall commander, his first encounter with Robert E. Lee was in December 1862 at Fredericksburg, Virginia. It was here that 172,000 troops faced each other in combat, the greatest number in any battle during the American Civil War.
A chicken could not have lived upon that field when we opened up on it.
We might as well have tried to take hell.
Basically, Burnside got the jump on Robert E. Lee and got his army to the banks of the Rappahannock River while Robert E. Lee was nowhere around.
He doesn't have his troops into place until December. It's a cold and windy December. He has to cross rivers, and he needs pontoon bridges, and they're being brought up slowly, and it's a wet December, so there's alternately mud and ice that the soldiers have to trudge through and cold that they have to deal with.
The problem was that the pontoon boats weren't coming, and it took a long time for Ambrose Burnside to get his pontoons, and that meant that he wasn't able to build his bridges on schedule, and that meant that the rebels had time to quite deliberately build some excellent firing positions with two corps up on Marie's Heights overlooking the Union crossings at Fredericksburg.
Still, Ambrose Burnside realizes that the reason why why his predecessors relieved of command, George McClellan, is because he wasn't aggressive enough in launching an offensive campaign. So he knew he had to attack before winter set in. Problem is, now Lee knows what he wants to do, and it's much easier to defend than it is to attack.
And by the time Burnside gets his bridges built and starts crossing, the whole rebel army is sitting on top of Marye's Heights at Fredericksburg, firing down from the front and from the flank on the Union as they cross.
The Union forces cross the Rappahannock, go through Fredericksburg, and confront the Confederate forces at Marye's Heights. But the problem they have is that they're at the foot of a hill. So what do? Burnside orders the attack anyway.
The Union forces begin marching, line abreast, brigade by brigade, across the open space between the town and Marye's Heights. And the rebels are standing behind a slightly sunken road, behind a stout stone wall in a natural trench system. To the front and to the flank, they're along a ridge, a bare ridge that can fire into the flank of the Union forces as they walk up this hill. And they just march up the hill towards that sunken road, and they're massacred. Brigade by brigade, in dribs and drabs, Burnside sends his troops up this gentle slope where there is no cover except one little ditch, and they are massacred as they try to climb the heights to Fredericksburg.
Now, some people don't think of it as much of a massacre, but that's what it was. They charge and charge and charge again into Confederate rifle fire until finally Burnside and his officers realize that they will not be able to rout the Confederate forces, and they retreat.
We tend sometimes to place all our emphasis on the Eastern Theater of War. Hence, the Battle of Fredericksburg generally is seen as the final big battle of 1862. But it wasn't. In the Western Theater of War, in the Tennessee Theater, another battle was taking shape. And that battle is going to be called the Battle of Murfreesboro by the Confederates, or the Battle of Stones River by the Union.
Here, between December 31st, 1862 and January 2nd, 1863, the Confederate General Braxton Bragg, commanding the Army of Tennessee, faced the Union General William S. Rosecrans, commander of the Army of the Cumberland. Appalling weather preceded a confusing and bloody battle marked by massive Confederate frontal attacks against Union positions. In the face of heavy losses, the Confederates continued to charge, and on January 2nd were pummeled by Union artillery as they crossed Stones River. Despite 13,000 Union casualties, Lincoln was desperate to claim the victory. And so the bloody year of 1862 came to a close. For all the pain and suffering, deprivation and hardship, broken bodies and makeshift graves, was an end to the war any nearer? It seemed not. In the North, a poor showing in the November elections and the disaster at Fredericksburg had put Lincoln under enormous pressure. Some thought the strain was beginning to tell. In the South, the victory at Fredericksburg had come as a welcome boost, and anyway, there was little else to do but carry on. Already, thousands of sons of the South had died to preserve the Southern way of life. The Confederacy had come within a hair's breadth of defeat, and within touching distance of victory. The war was not even halfway through, and the sacrifices made by the men and women of the North and the South were far from over. In fact, though few would have believed it possible, matters were to get steadily worse. After more than 18 months of increasingly intense and bitter fighting, the new year of 1863 brought no prospect of relief for the Union and the Confederacy. With the bloodshed at Shiloh, the 7 Days, Second Manassas, and Antietam still fresh in the memory, the costly defeat at Fredericksburg during December 1862 had come as a terrible shock to the North, and had naturally raised the spirits of the embattled South. But throughout the land, war weariness was spreading. This was particularly so in the North, where even news of the close victory at Stone's River at the beginning of the new year did little to raise public morale. After the slaughter at Fredericksburg, the hospitals of Washington were full to overflowing. The cost of the war in dollars continued to rise with each passing day, meaning taxes in the Union states had to be increased. Perhaps not surprisingly, Army recruitment dropped off dramatically. These factors, among many others, contributed to the growing disillusionment with the war throughout the North. Many of the voices that had once cried forward to Richmond were now heard wondering aloud if victory should be won at any price. Despite all this, there was to be no end to the fighting. The fact was that too many lives had already been lost for either side to turn back. Those who called the shots were determined to forge ahead to win their victory. This was total war.
Tramp, 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 the boys are marching. Cheer up, comrades, they will come. And beneath the starry flag we shall breathe the air again of the free land in our own beloved home.
The strategic situation during the winter of 1863 basically saw most of the major armies staring at each other, very little maneuvering and fighting going on.
The Confederacy is running out of money, running out of human resources, and running out of military supplies. The Confederacy must act to end the war as rapidly as possible early in 1863. They're not getting any bigger, they're not getting any stronger. They have to fight the war to a conclusion right away.
Lincoln had in command of the Western theater sort of a pack of, I think, incompetent, politically appointed generals, while the man who would become his best general, Ulysses Grant, was sitting there virtually unused, ignored. I think he was being punished for the high cost of Shiloh.
1863 is going to be disastrous for the Confederacy. Robert E. Lee, at the point that at the beginning, he's going to be drunk somewhat on victory. He's still quite a risk taker, but it is his risk taking that's going to hurt him in the long run.
This morning we found ourselves covered with snow that had fallen during the night. It is too cold to write. How I would like to have one of those On to Richmond fellows out here with us in the snow.
I can't tell you how many dead I did see. One thing's for sure. I don't want to see that sight no more.
This is the time when Lincoln is confiding privately to his friends, we are on the brink of destruction. Even God is against us, and I cannot see a ray of hope. Jefferson Davis has a ray of hope still, which is European recognition of the Confederacy, still. And his greatest headache, like Lincoln's, is domestic opposition to the draft. The Southern draft exempted one white man from every plantation with more than 20 slaves, which in effect meant that the bulk of the fighting for the South was being done by poor white men. So here you had the interests of that plantation elite, the planter class, going against the interests of Southern unity. And the cracks were beginning to show.
The cold, wet winter months of early 1863 forced a respite from the fighting on both the Union and Confederate armies. Quite apart from the bitter cold, roads turned into a quagmire of mud, making movement almost impossible. And so the troops of the Northern and Southern armies had to hunker down and await the spring sunshine. Not that the lack of action lessened the pressure or eased the difficulties faced by the soldiers. Huge numbers of men living in cramped conditions with poor sanitation meant only two things: illness and disease. Now it was not Yankee or rebel bullets that were decimating the ranks, but dysentery, diphtheria, measles, and scarlet fever.
Well, disease was the great killer of the Civil War. A lot of the problem was poor sanitation in the camps. Men drinking water that was contaminated. Men who came from rural areas suddenly thrust together with men from the cities. These young men from the rural areas had never been exposed to common childhood diseases, and thus they were very susceptible to catching that.
A lot of the soldiers themselves didn't understand how to maintain a sanitary campground. So you would have situations in which regiments camped along a river, and soldiers would throw their refuse into the river, or they would build their latrines close to the river, and waste materials would seep into the water. That means for the troops downstream, the water wasn't as healthy, and it led to certain diseases such as dysentery and cholera and that sort of thing.
Medical provision for sick and wounded men in both armies was rudimentary at best. Germ theory had not yet been discovered. There was little appreciation of the need for hygiene, and field hospitals often did little more than speed the wounded soldiers to their graves. Their grim reputation spread throughout the ranks of the blue and gray, and there are recorded instances of wounded men refusing to leave the battlefield, preferring to take their chances there rather than face almost certain death at the hands of an army surgeon.
When people are hospitalized, they are at the mercy of 19th century traditional heroic medicine. And the interventions that were conducted in the 19th century, the amputations, the chunks of your insides that they were prepared to haul out for bizarre reasons, it's shocking. I mean, this was a time when people thought there must be a cure for everything, and perhaps the more violent and foul the cure, the more likely it was to work. When you were wounded, you were at a tremendous risk of post-operative infection, shock from being operated on without anesthesia or with primitive anesthesia, and then afterwards contracting communicable disease in one of the huge unsanitary hospitals that were being run at the time.
There were other factors that affected morale among ordinary troops. Sheer boredom was one. Having little to do gave men time to think about family, hearth, and home. A homesick man was not the best fighting soldier. An army, it is said, marches on its stomach. Filling the stomachs of Civil War soldiers with the right food, or in the case of the South, any food at all, was a constant problem. The marching rations of the Northern troops were salt pork, pickled beef, and hardtack biscuits, and the troops sat down to these less than tasty menu items most days while they were on campaign. Although their daily fare was somewhat better while they were in camp, at least their bellies were full. The winter months were a time of almost starvation rations for Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia and Braxton Bragg's Army of Tennessee, as Southern supply problems really began to bite.
The rebels did not have enough food. They did not have, in particular, enough fresh fruit and vegetables to supply their people. They did not have enough wagons to carry the food. They did not have enough mules to pull the wagons. They had to use horses, which could otherwise have been used on farms or for cavalry or artillery. to pull supply wagons, whereas the North, by 1863, was going over to an all-mule logistics system. The rebel supply system was not up to the task of fighting a modern industrial war. It is amazing that rebel morale could be supported by other means, because it certainly was not supported by having a hot dinner and a cup of coffee and a cigar, which the Union Army could provide.
There was a popular Southern love song, a real weepy, called Lorena, very popular amongst the troops. Went, the years creep slowly by, Lorena. The snow is on the grass again. You know, it went on like that. I'll spare you the rest of it. The point is that at one point, Robert E. Lee, who knew the value of music and the impact it had on an army, attempted to have this song banned from anywhere within the hearing of his troops because he was afraid of the desertions that it might cause. Because by far the greatest number of Southern desertions was caused by the soldiers receiving letters from their sweethearts or their wives, you know, in which the letters would describe destitution on the farms and, you know, the starvation of their children. And this increased to epidemic proportions as the war dragged on. The Northern Army, too, was riddled with desertions, particularly in the immediate aftermath of Fredericksburg, when they were losing something like 100 men a day to desertion. And this was at the risk of some really horrendous consequences, things which may have been officially prohibited, but which went on anyway. You could be branded in your forehead with a letter D from a hot iron. You could have your head shaved, be drummed out into the wilderness to fend for yourself. You could be locked to a ball and chain. And for repeated desertions, you could face the firing squad. I think there were something like 260 executions in the federal ranks throughout the war, and well over half of those were for desertions.
After the debacle at Fredericksburg, Lincoln replaced the luckless Burnside with General Joseph Hooker as commander of the Army of the Potomac. Hooker was yet another colorful character in the story of the Civil War. He was brave, an excellent organizer, but self-serving, vain, and boastful. Hooker set about improving the lot of the Army of the Potomac in part by the simple expedient of increasing rations and ensuring the men were paid. As a result, there were fewer deserters. Some even rejoined the Army. He was, though, an outspoken critic of Abraham Lincoln, and his appointment can be seen as either a highly magnanimous act by Lincoln or as a sure sign of the president's increasing desperation. In reality, he did not have much of a choice, as Burnside had been relieved of his duties at his own request, and several of the more capable generals had themselves been relieved or transferred as a result of the Fredericksburg debacle. As the spring of 1863 arrived, the Confederate forces around Fredericksburg prepared themselves for the inevitable federal attack on the heavily defended town. But it was not here that the battle eventually took place. That came 10 miles west of Fredericksburg, at a place called Chancellorsville.
Hooker, despite his reputation, was a much better general than tradition has it. For one thing, he'd fought at several of the major encounters already, and he'd learned that troops making a frontal assault against well-entrenched soldiers was going to lead to massive casualties and not much land gained. And he saw this particularly at Mary's Heights at Fredericksburg. He dismissed Ambrose Burnside, the architect of that plan, as having a brain the size of a hickory nut. And as he put it, he lost the number of men that he was required to lose, and then he stopped. So what he intended to do at Chancellorsville was draw Lee out from behind his defenses by moving towards Richmond. So if Lee did not come out in the open and fight him, he would have to surrender Richmond, the Confederate capital. In other words, what Hooker was doing was anticipating the moves of Ulysses S. Grant, that is, to force Lee out into the open to fight the much larger Union forces.
Yet again, the Confederate Army was vastly outnumbered. The ratio was nearly 2-to-1. Hooker was confident not only of victory, but also of annihilating Lee's army. He wrote, "The enemy must either ingloriously fly or come out from behind his defenses and give us battle upon our own ground, where certain destruction awaits him." But he had underestimated the skills of his opponent. Hooker could not have anticipated two audacious moves by Lee and Stonewall Jackson that flew in the face of all military convention. Firstly, Lee divided his outnumbered army, and secondly, he divided again, allowing Jackson to make his celebrated 14-mile march around the Federal positions and put himself in position to attack the Union right flank.
Stonewall Jackson's troops virtually strolled right across the front line, the Federal front line, and they didn't know anything about it. Nor did they know how meager, how thin was the force that Lee had left behind to defend Fredericksburg. Lee gambled that Hooker would be deceived enough to allow Jackson to complete that 12-mile march. And that gamble paid off, because when Hooker's spies told him that they'd seen Jackson's forces pulling out, initially heading south, well, Hooker just thought, yeah, this is the Confederate retreat that I've been predicting. So he had no idea of what was going to come next.
The dense forest that surrounds Chancellorsville is known as the Wilderness. This was yet another name that would soon write itself in blood into the folklore of the Civil War. On the evening of May 2nd, while the Union troops were preparing their evening rations, 28,000 Confederate troops suddenly fell upon them from the woods. The terrified Union soldiers turned tail and fled, although eventually they rallied to engage in some of the fiercest and most vicious fighting of the war. In the tangled mass of trees, men fired at each other from point-blank range. It was said that hardly a tree was left unscarred by the gunfire. Only nightfall put an end to the Confederate advance. Tragically for the Confederates, Stonewall Jackson was seriously wounded in the darkness. The following day, May 3rd, more terrible fighting took place. But it was not Hooker and the Union forces that were moving forward to counterattack. The Union commander seemed as paralyzed by uncertainty and lack of confidence as McClellan before him, and he chose to remain on the defensive, despite the fact that Lee's army was now divided into 3 parts. Even more incredibly, the Union commander threw away the opportunity won by the capture of Mary's Heights at Fredericksburg. Here, the Union's 6th Corps had overwhelmed the troops Lee had left behind to defend the city, and Lee was therefore forced to detail troops to stop the Union threat, now heading towards him from Fredericksburg. Lee left 25,000 troops to face Hooker, and brought the rest eastwards to defeat the 6th Corps at a place called Salem's Church.
Hooker doesn't have a clear picture of the battlefield from where he is at Chancellorsville Farm. He can't understand what's going on close to him, within a couple of miles of Chancellorsville Farm, because the country is so dense. He does not have good communications with Fredericksburg, where he's got people fighting to try to pin Lee in place on Mary's Heights. And once Hooker's injured, he is completely dysfunctional for the rest of the day. Hooker is not functioning as the tactical commander at the Battle of Chancellorsville.
Hooker had been knocked unconscious by a cannonball that crashed into his headquarters. But later, he said it himself. I wasn't hurt by a shell, and I wasn't even drunk. I just lost confidence in old Joe Hooker, and that's all there is to it.
Robert E. Lee had masterminded the greatest tactical masterpiece of the war. 17,000 Union troops had become casualties, and the news of the defeat resounded around the North. My God, what will the country say?" said Lincoln when told of the catastrophe. The president knew knives that had been sharpened during the winter months would now be poised to strike. While in the North, Lincoln calculated the cost of defeat at Chancellorsville. In the South, Lee was finally learning the price of victory. 13,000 troops, nearly a quarter of his army, were dead or wounded, and Lee knew full well that the South, with its limited pool of manpower, simply could not trade losses like these with the North. Sadly for Lee, there was more bad news to come. News that would make the victory at Chancellorsville seem hollow. On May 10th, Stonewall Jackson, Lee's most able and trusted commander in the field, breathed his last. Jackson had been shot the week before, not by a Federal bullet, but by shots from a Confederate volley. The great soldier's left arm had been amputated, and at first it appeared that he would recover, but it was not to be. For the South, and for Lee in particular, the loss of Jackson was a savage blow. The great commander knew only too well that the South's mountainous task was now even more difficult without Jackson's bold, adventurous leadership on the battlefield.
Jackson was a great battlefield commander. Lee was said to have mentioned after he heard that Jackson had his left arm amputated, well, he has lost his left arm, but I have lost my right arm. And this probably was the case. There are a lot of what-if questions. What if Jackson would have survived? We can't answer that because he didn't survive the pneumonia, which finally took his life. But it certainly was a great loss because there were no other generals in the Confederate Army, in the Army of Northern Virginia, that displayed Jackson's audacity on the battlefield, his coolness under fire, his fearlessness, his ability to inspire his troops and to drive his troops against overwhelming odds.
While the Battle of Chancellorsville had been a costly humiliation for the North, there was better news from the deep South. It was there that Union forces under Ulysses S. Grant had outmaneuvered Confederate forces and were about to lay siege to Vicksburg on the Mississippi River. The culmination of a well-planned and bold campaign that made Grant into a Northern hero. The North needed heroes as much as victories, and well executed though the Vicksburg campaign was, Grant could hardly have foreseen the plaudits and press adulation that suddenly came his way.
Grant is the first Union general to win a big victory. And when after the prolonged siege of Vicksburg, the fortress on the Mississippi that is so important to uniting the Confederacy east and west across the Mississippi River. Once Grant takes this strategic point and opens up the Mississippi to the Union so that they can move freely right down to the Gulf of Mexico. Once Grant does that, he has provided the first victory that the Union has encountered.
The siege of Vicksburg was quite horrible for the Confederate defenders and the citizens of Vicksburg itself. That part of Mississippi in the summer is extremely hot. Imagine Confederate defenders in exposed positions, in trenches, and in artillery positions with no shelter. Imagine the terrified citizens of Vicksburg under constant bombardment, not only from Union artillery surrounding Vicksburg, but also from the Union Navy on the Mississippi River. The citizens had to resort to living underground in many cases, where caves were dug in the hills around Vicksburg, and the citizens would live in the caves. Pretty soon a food shortage occurred because Vicksburg was totally surrounded and cut off by the Union Army and Union Navy. There were only so many rations in Vicksburg to begin with. Now they had to be shared by the Confederate soldiers and by the citizens themselves. As horses and mules died or were killed from combat, their flesh was stripped and was eaten by the citizens and by the soldiers. In some cases, they had to resort to killing rats and eating rats. All of this combined made the situation quite bad for the Southerners.
After the fall of Vicksburg, Lincoln wrote to Grant. He said, "My dear General, I don't believe you and I have ever met personally." And then he went on to tell Grant how surprised he'd been by the various steps Grant had taken. You know, "I thought you should have done this, but you did that. I thought you should have gone south to get some reinforcements, but you didn't. You turned north. I thought it was a mistake. You brought us victory. And I want to personally acknowledge here that you were right and I was wrong." You know, this was the commander-in-chief sweeping aside all of his glittering top brass and humbling himself to a plain, quiet, mid-ranking general.
The spring days of 1863 slowly turned to early summer, and the ever-ambitious Lee looked to build upon the victory at Chancellorsville by staging a second invasion of the North. This time, he planned to outflank Washington and to move against cities to the north of the capital. Just think of the panic that would grip the North, he reasoned, if Confederate forces were seen marching towards a place such as New York. Lee, of course, was an offensive-minded commander who desperately wanted to take the war out of Virginia and to strike the enemy on his own ground. His army would then be able to feed on the bounty of the northern land and perhaps win a major victory at the same time. In June 1863 came another significant moment in the story of the Civil War. It happened on June 9th at Brandy Station in northern Virginia, when two great forces of Federal and Confederate cavalry clashed in what would be the biggest cavalry battle of the entire war. Up until then, the Southern cavalrymen had believed themselves to be invincible. They were without doubt superior horsemen, and a myth had grown on each side that nobody could defeat them on the battlefield. They were commanded by James Ewell Brown Stuart, better known to all as Jeb, a dashing, gallant cavalryman, a brave warrior, but a man with a streak of vanity that made him determined to protect and enhance his own great reputation. At Brandy Station, the unthinkable happened. The Federal cavalry caught the Confederates unaware and for the first time matched them in battle. The Southern cavalry were not routed, far from it, for it was the Federals who eventually withdrew across the Rappahannock River to regroup. But they survived an extremely close call. In one day, the myth of Confederate cavalry invincibility was shattered, and Jeb Stuart had suffered a huge blow to his reputation, the restoration of which became a major priority in his life. It would not be long before Lee and the Southern Army had cause to curse Stuart's personal vanity.
In the American Civil War, it becomes clear that cavalry is useful for reconnaissance, for raiding, and for protecting lines of communication, and that's about all. Jeb Stuart does not see this. Jeb Stuart sees cavalry as a romantic extension of cavalry in the past, in the Middle Ages. And he sees cavalry action as a decisive arm in the American Civil War. And that puts him fundamentally at odds with the changing reality of battle. And that means that on occasion, as he did before Gettysburg, Jeb Stuart will go riding off into the countryside, seeking to achieve some sort of decisive effect, and ignoring reconnaissance, raiding, and securing lines of communication.
By the last week of June, Lee had crossed the Potomac, had arrived in Pennsylvania, and his army was preparing to attack Harrisburg. General Hooker had retained command of the Union forces after the Chancellorsville debacle only because Lincoln was unable to find an obvious replacement. Now, Hooker wanted the large Union garrison at Harper's Ferry to be assigned to the Army of the Potomac. When his request was refused, he gave Lincoln an ultimatum. If his demands were not met, he would resign as commander. It was not exactly with a heavy heart that Lincoln chose to accept Hooker's resignation. The man given the onerous task of stopping Lee's army was General George Meade. Meade was a quick-tempered Pennsylvanian who, through his efforts at Chancellorsville and earlier at Fredericksburg, had proved to the increasingly desperate Lincoln that, unlike his predecessor, he was a man of action, unlikely to be fazed by the problems of supply or fears of numerical disadvantage. And now that a major battle on Pennsylvanian soil appeared to be imminent, appointing a native Pennsylvanian to command the Army of the Potomac was surely a wise move. President Lincoln even remarked, "Meade will fight well on his own dunghill." And so it proved. It took only a day or two for Meade to mobilize his forces and to begin a march to meet his enemy. Neither Meade nor Lee could possibly have guessed that the most famous and crucial battle of the Civil War was now only hours away. It allegedly came about through want of shoes and provisions. Lured by the prospect of purloining some much-needed footwear from the local stores, a brigade of Confederate infantrymen made their way to a small Pennsylvanian market town that would write its name in blood into the pages of American history. Gettysburg.
After General Lee's smashing victory in the face of overwhelming odds at the Battle of Chancellorsville, Lee decided perhaps the time was ripe once again for another invasion of Northern Territory. And so he approached President Jefferson Davis and members of his cabinet later in May to gain their approval for such a move. Lee truly believed that to win the war, he would have to win a major victory on Northern soil to get the Northern people to ask Lincoln for a negotiated peace. And again, there are some who think that Lee wanted to get the combat out of Virginia, which was his native state. Lee successfully convinced the president that this move northward was the thing to do. And so that sets the stage for the withdrawal of his Army of Northern Virginia away from Fredericksburg for their move west to the Shenandoah Valley, using the mountains to mask their movements, to screen their movements, to move north, down the Shenandoah Valley, moving northward towards the Potomac River and Maryland and Pennsylvania.
So it was that on July 1st, 1863, the Confederate forces of A.P. Hill almost stumbled into 2 brigades of Union cavalry commanded by General John Buford. Buford's men, who had fought with distinction at Brandy Station, were in position some 2 miles northwest of Gettysburg, and they were vastly outnumbered. However, they were armed with breech-loading carbines that gave them a great advantage in firepower over the muzzle-loaded rifles carried by the Confederate infantry, and the Union men were able to make an effective fighting retreat. General Lee arrived in Gettysburg during the afternoon, accompanied by General James Longstreet, a man upon whom, in the wake of Stonewall Jackson's death, Lee had come to rely. Lee was perturbed to hear the sound of fighting, for he had no idea of the strength or size of the Union forces that faced him. The reason for this was the absence of Jeb Stuart and his cavalry, the cavalry that Lee referred to as the eyes and ears of his army. Lee, clearly irritated that the cavalry had failed to show up, said to his fellow commanders, "I cannot think what has become of Stuart. I am in ignorance of what we have in front of us here." What would have been his mood had he known exactly why Stuart and his men were not yet at Gettysburg?
Jeb Stuart, the eyes of the Army of Northern Virginia, was missing at Gettysburg because he went on a circuitous ride around the Union troops. His job most of the time was to go out and disrupt Union supply routes, engage their cavalry, and he had some unclear instructions, or what he thought were unclear instructions, from General Lee. So instead of sending out patrols and reconnoitering the area around Gettysburg and serving as the eyes of the Army, he went on one of his rides around the Army of the Potomac to disrupt their supply routes. He engaged their cavalry and as such. And though he was successful in this mission, he left the Army of Northern Virginia blind, and that had some disastrous results. Lee may have been able to make other decisions on the first day and the second day had he had his cavalry with him to scout out positions and to see where the weaknesses were.
The fighting raged on during the afternoon of July 1st, and gradually the Confederate attacks, pressed home by Generals A.P. Hill and Jubal Early, began to bear fruit. By late afternoon, thousands of troops from the Union 1st and 11th Corps were fleeing through the streets of Gettysburg. They rallied in two positions to the south of the town. One was Cemetery Hill, the other was Culp's Hill. That first evening of the battle left American history with some of its greatest what-ifs. What if Early had pressed on to attack the Union positions? Surely the Confederates would have won the battle on the very first day. What if Jackson had still been alive and had been leading the attack? Perhaps his legendary boldness would have been the deciding factor. Of course, no one will ever know. All that is certain is that Early declined to attack the Federal positions on Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill, and that, perhaps, the best chance of a Southern victory was lost.
If Lee had pressed the attack, if it had been possible for him to concentrate rapidly and press the attack on the first day of Gettysburg, and if he'd been able to overrun the Union there, then the Union would not have chosen to fight him. The Battle of Gettysburg happens because the Union is able, unhindered, to occupy positions on Cemetery Ridge. And if they are not able, unhindered, to do so because, for instance, the rebels had got up Cemetery Ridge first, there would be no reason for Meade to attack Cemetery Ridge. Why? Stupid. Not at all. All Meade's got to do is prepare to fight with Lee somewhere else.
July 2nd dawned, and the Union troops were now in strong defensive positions on Cemetery Hill, a section of Cemetery Ridge, and also on Culp's Hill, and reinforcements were arriving by the hour. On the Confederate side, there was a fundamental disagreement between Lee and Longstreet over strategy. Lee, remembering the rich rewards gained by forcing the pace at Chancellorsville, was determined to go on the offensive. Longstreet, though, was a more cautious man who believed, with some justification, that the South usually won its battles by fighting on the defensive. Lee would hear none of Longstreet's plan to withdraw to a defensive position between Gettysburg and Washington. "I am going to attack him," he told Longstreet, who returned to his troops full of foreboding. Longstreet's slowness in deploying his men for the attack during the afternoon attracted much criticism after the war. Was he sulking because his advice had been ignored? Some even suggested afterwards that his lack of urgency was an act of insubordination against Lee. Whatever the truth, by the time Longstreet's men were ready to attack their target, the Federal left on Cemetery Ridge. It was no longer there. The Union Third Corps, under the flamboyant Major General Daniel E. Sickles, had taken up a new position in a salient, stretching between two infamous landmarks of the battle, the Peach Orchard and Devil's Den, with his right wing extending up the Emmitsburg Road. Sickles' move placed his men on higher ground, but his decision to change position was made unilaterally. Worse yet, no one in the Army of the Potomac had seemed to notice the tactical importance of a rocky hill known to the locals as Little Round Top. Located to the south of the Union defenses, a Union signal detachment had been using it as a vantage point to send flag signals. If the Confederates could seize that hill, the entire Union position would be threatened. Here was the perfect opportunity for the Confederates to outflank the Union positions and make an attack to its rear. Determined to seize the moment, Longstreet urged a change of tactics on Lee, but the Confederate commander had made up his mind, and he ordered Longstreet to continue with the original plan, which now meant an attack on Sickles' exposed position. At around 4 o'clock, Longstreet's 20,000 men moved forward.
The Union forever, hurrah, boys, hurrah! Down with the traitor and up with the star, while we rally round the flag, boys, rally once again, shouting the battle cry of freedom. Yes, we'll
The combat that occurs during the afternoon of July 2nd, 1863 is some of the most ferocious that will occur during the entire Civil War. And the fighting is going to revolve around a couple of significant geographical features. One of them is Devil's Den. Well, Devil's Den is going to anchor the left flank of the Third Corps defensive line. The center of the Third Corps line will be at a place called the Peach Orchard, which is at the intersection of a farm road and a major thoroughfare called the Emmitsburg Road. The Third Corps line is not supposed to be there. And General Sickles moves his corps out without orders, and when General Lee's plan to attack down the Emmitsburg Road is carried out, he's going to run smack dab into the Third Corps where it's not supposed to be. But the Third Corps is isolated, and the various units of the Confederate attacking force will smash into the Third Corps line and send it reeling back in retreat. And another area of the battlefield that becomes very famous for the amount of blood spilled there lies between Devil's Den and the Peach Orchard, and that's just simply called the Wheat Field. The fighting that occurs in the Wheat Field is very bloody and very confusing. The best way to describe it is like a whirlpool, where the fighting continuously goes in circles. And at one point, Union soldiers are looking to their front and fighting Confederates. At another point, the Confederates are on their left, the Confederates are on their right, and vice versa.
Meanwhile, at Little Round Top, on the Federal left flank, a crisis point for the Union had arrived. Luckily for George Meade, he had sent Brigadier General Gouverneur Warren, his chief engineer, to reconnoiter the Union defenses. Warren rode down to Little Round Top in order to survey the positions with his field glasses, and from that vantage point, he spotted Confederate forces getting into position for a flank attack. Warren had previously commanded an infantry brigade, and although he was now only a staff officer, he used his general's authority to order 2 brigades from the Union 5th Corps to move to the defense of Little Round Top. Little Round Top became the crucial arena of the battle for the remainder of the day. It was here that the extreme left flank of the entire Union Army came under attack. The man charged with responsibility for defending that vulnerable position was the extraordinary Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, commander of the 20th Maine Infantry.
Joshua Chamberlain was in charge of the 20th Maine, and he wasn't a career soldier. Chamberlain was a college professor. He taught languages and rhetoric at Bowdoin College in Maine. And he and his men were defending the heights to the left of Cemetery Ridge. And for 2 hours, they'd stood there pushing back line after line of Confederates who were just knocking themselves out, trying to push their way up the ridge. And eventually, Chamberlain's regiment had been just chipped away. There were 2/3 of his men lying dead around him, and the rest of them had run out of bullets. And meanwhile, the Confederates had regrouped, and they were coming at them again. So Chamberlain just ordered his men to fix bayonets and charge, screaming their heads off, just, outdo the rebel yell. And the Confederates were stunned. They didn't expect what they got. They didn't expect a bayonet charge of such audacity and such ferocity, and they dropped their guns. And the Union kept possession of the heights.
Night fell on July 2nd, and it was time to consider what had been gained or lost during a day of furious action. The frenzied Confederate attacks against Culp's Hill and the eastern portion of Cemetery Hill on the Union right flank had met with only limited success. Only the salient once occupied by Sickles' men had fallen into their hands. Elsewhere, the Union position remained as it had at the beginning of a dark day of terrible fighting. During the first 2 days of the battle, almost 35,000 men had been killed or wounded, and there was still no end to the battle in sight. As the bodies of the dead awaited burial and the surgeons of both sides went about their dreadful business, Jeb Stuart finally arrived at the Confederate lines with his cavalry. Lee gave him a frosty reception. July 3rd, and the sun came up on what would prove to be the final day of the Battle of Gettysburg. Lee and Longstreet still could not agree on tactics. Longstreet pleaded to be allowed to outflank the Union Army on its extreme left, but again, Lee would not be moved. He correctly believed the Federal lines were at their weakest in the center, and it was there that he intended his forces to make their attack. Longstreet later wrote that he left the meeting with a heavy heart, but he hurried off, albeit with a sense of dread, to organize the artillery bombardment that would precede the assault. Jeb Stuart, no doubt eager to redeem himself in the eyes of Lee, was dispatched to the east of Gettysburg with his cavalry to engage the rear of the Union positions. But his Confederate horsemen were no longer infallible or invincible. Stuart was stopped in his tracks by 5,000 Union cavalrymen in a battle that ensured he was never able to get near enough to influence the main action at Gettysburg itself. It was during this action that a certain George Armstrong Custer, at the head of a brigade of Michigan cavalry, first came to prominence. While the cavalry battle raged, a fresh division of Virginians under General George Pickett, supplemented by men from A.P. Hill's corps, were preparing themselves for their attack. What must have been their feelings as they saw what awaited them? An advance of nearly 3/4 of a mile across open land to reach the heavily defended Union positions. At 3 o'clock, the thunderous Confederate bombardment lifted. The order came to begin the attack, and one of the most tragic episodes in American military history was about to unfold. This was Longstreet's grand assault, more commonly remembered as Pickett's charge.
What happened was the Confederate artillery opened up to soften up the defenders, and George Gordon Meade ordered the Union cannons to one by one fall silent to make it look as if they'd been knocked out. That way it would convince the Confederates there was no more artillery left to blast their advancing soldiers. The plan worked. Pickett's men charged up the hill, and then the Union artillery opened up, as did the Union soldiers. Frankly, it was a massacre. Nonetheless, by sheer raw courage, some Confederates managed to actually make it to that stone wall and breach the Union defenses very briefly.
And then are repulsed. This breaks the back of the Confederate effort at Gettysburg. And in fact, it is called the high tide of the Confederacy, because the number of losses at Gettysburg greatly hampers the ability of the Army of Northern Virginia to operate.
It was all my fault. Get together and let us do the best we can towards saving that which is left us.
General Lee, I have no division now.
The dead lay in the open fields, among the rocks, behind trees and in buildings. They lay in streams, by walls, in hedges, wherever their weakening steps could carry them.
Meade wouldn't launch a counterattack because he didn't know how badly Lee's forces had been decimated. I mean, some of his men actually expected the order of a counterattack, and so they launched one themselves against the rebels retreating around Little Round Top. And although they were on the retreat, the rebels turned around and wiped them out, but that didn't really help them anyway. Longstreet got hit on the retreat by 2 Federal divisions, and really that was it. The Confederates pulled out. Lee knew that his invasion of the North was over, and he slipped quietly across the Potomac.
After the appalling carnage of July 3rd, Robert E. Lee realized that the Battle of Gettysburg could not be won, and he decided to retreat towards Virginia with his bleeding and battered troops. In torrential rain, an ambulance train that stretched for several miles carried more than 10,000 wounded Confederates towards their home state. They left 6,000 dead comrades behind them.
Gettysburg was as far north as the rebel army got, and that mark was the closest the rebel army came to defeating the Union Army and possibly getting recognition for the Confederate States. After Pickett's charge, after the Battle of Gettysburg, the rebel army is no longer capable of fighting the sequence of tactical actions that Robert E. Lee had hoped to fight towards Washington.
5,000 Union troops were also killed during the battle that had been the defining moment of the war thus far. In Washington, the politicians threw up their hands in horror at Meade's failure to follow up the victory with a crushing blow that might have ended the war. Little did they know he was almost out of ammunition. In Richmond, they feared that after Gettysburg, all hope of an independent South might be gone. If the defeat at Gettysburg were not enough, on July 4th, Independence Day, Vicksburg also surrendered.
If you look at Gettysburg in combination with the defeat at Vicksburg, you will see that the Confederacy is no longer defending itself. It's just trying to survive. With the Union victory at Vicksburg, the Confederacy is split in half. With the Union victory at Gettysburg, one of its major armies has been shattered. Lee limps across the Potomac River to sit in defense and wait for the oncoming battles.
Well, Gettysburg showed that the Northern forces were not just a bunch of, lily-livered, pasty-faced shopkeepers. It showed that even their college professors could, lead their men to combat Southern fury and determination with Northern fury and determination. It was certainly Lee's worst defeat, and it was the end of his hopes for invading the North.
And so the year 1863 rolled on. In the North, Lincoln had earlier signed the Enrollment Act in an attempt to conscript men between 20 and 45 into the Army, and this triggered violent protests, known to history as the draft riots, in many northern cities. The worst was in New York, only 10 days after Gettysburg. Here, a demonstration against the Enrollment Act spiraled out of control and turned quickly into a full-scale riot, during which several black Americans were lynched. In the South, the shortages got worse and prices continued to soar. Although news of the Confederate victory at Chickamauga Creek in the northwest corner of Georgia near the border of Tennessee came to bolster morale. Here, Southern troops from Tennessee and Virginia under the command of Braxton Bragg and James Longstreet had driven the Union Army back to Chattanooga. A tactical error by the Northern General Rosecrans could have resulted in a costly disaster for the Union, but swift action, in particular by General George Thomas, prevented the defeat at Chickamauga Creek turning into a complete catastrophe. It was, however, a very welcome victory for the South. But any joy was tempered by news of the casualty figures. 18,000 men had been killed or wounded. The Southern pool of manpower was being further drained with each passing week and month. On November 19, 1863, Abraham Lincoln journeyed to the newly created military cemetery at Gettysburg. There, during the dedication ceremony, he gave a short, 2-minute speech that became known as the Gettysburg Address. Some who heard it thought it inadequate for the occasion. But Lincoln's fine words have echoed down the years to provide a powerful rallying cry for democracy, not only in America, but throughout the world.
The nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people.
Lee had been practically at the gates of Philadelphia, and he'd been beaten back. So there went all Confederate hopes of French or British intervention on the side of the Confederacy.
Their supplies are dwindling, their stocks of horse flesh, their human resources, their stocks of weapons and ammunition are all depleting, and the Southern economy is beginning to show serious signs of falling apart.
And Lee, though he believes he can hold off a Union offensive, Grant is going to push the effort even harder. Lee has met his match. Someone who's willing to take the same risks. Someone who's willing to expend the lives necessary to obtain his goal.
The end of the year 1863 was quite a contrast to the beginning of 1863. We see the major Union victories at Vicksburg, at Gettysburg. So on the heels of that victory, the Lincoln administration will go into the year 1864 with high hopes. But still, 1864 will be one bloody year.
January 1864. The American Civil War was now nearly 3 years old. Those who had believed that the fight between the North and the South would be settled in one set-piece battle at Bull Run in 1861 had been proved cruelly wrong. For the North, there was frustration, for the tide of the war had turned, yet no decisive victory or breakthrough could be achieved. But for the South, there was desperation. A muster showed that only 278,000 of its 465,000 enlisted soldiers were actually available to fight. The rest were sick or wounded. In an attempt to shore up its dwindling manpower, the South extended the draft to include 17 to 50-year-olds, a move that increased the opposition to the already unpopular government of Jefferson Davis. Hyperinflation and shortages bit deep as the South grew ever more dependent on the blockade runners at sea. For all this, the war seemed to be at a stalemate, and still it dragged on.
The South could no longer go on the offensive, on the strategic offensive. The foray into Pennsylvania that culminated with the Battle of Gettysburg is the last time that any Confederate army is going to be able to strike into Northern territory. It had lost too many men during 1863. The strategy now is to defend as much Confederate territory as possible and hopefully break the will of the Northern people to continue the war.
The best thing for the Confederacy would have been a brisk defeat in the summer of 1864. They could not have done any better than they already had. They were a lost cause. Why fight a total war? Why allow the South to be ravaged by two armies when it would have been so much simpler to just give it up?
The early weeks of 1864 did little to convince anyone that there were quick military solutions or that any general, Confederate or Federal, was about to put forward a new strategy to speed the end of the war. Ever since the exhausting campaign had begun, Abraham Lincoln had struggled to find the right man to command the premier Eastern Army. McClellan, Burnside, Hooker, all had come and gone. George Meade still commanded the Army of the Potomac, but his failure to aggressively pursue the Army of Northern Virginia after the Battle of Gettysburg had left a bad impression on the president. But now Lincoln believed he had at last found the man he was looking for.
Politically, 1864 would be an election year, and Lincoln was fighting a rearguard action against some members of his own party. The radical wing had issued a private circular which actually made it into the newspapers. It was called the Pomeroy Circular. And in this published argument, they said their belief was that Lincoln could not be reelected. He was unelectable again, and they'd have to search for another candidate.
Lincoln had been saddled with overconfident commanders, incompetent commanders, officers who were not willing to fight, people who were too cautious. And he was promoting generals to general-in-chief or generals in charge of the Army of the Potomac who were facing a very crafty adversary, General Robert E. Lee. What he needed was someone who was just as much of a gambler, a risk-taker as Robert E. Lee, someone who was just as determined and crafty as Robert E. Lee, and he found this in the victor of Vicksburg.
Ulysses S. Grant, to this point in the war, had been the most successful field commander that the North had. His victories early on at Forts Henry and Donelson, his victory at Shiloh, his magnificent victory at Vicksburg, his ability to come into Chattanooga and to counterattack and break the siege of Chattanooga and send the Confederate Army of Tennessee away in defeat. All of these things were feathers in Ulysses Grant's cap. Lincoln liked him because he said that this man fights.
General Ulysses S. Grant was promoted lieutenant general and given overall command of federal forces in March 1864. Meade retained his position as commander of the Army of the Potomac, while Philip H. Sheridan went east with Grant and took over command of its cavalry.
Grant's plan for victory when he becomes general-in-chief in 1863 is to pin down the Army of Northern Virginia and destroy it. He believed that the one way to win the war was to seek out and destroy his enemy and that enemy's will to fight. So he was willing to fight an all-out war, a total war. In his strategy, he vows that if Lee decides to split his army and attempt any flanking movements, then he'll follow that army. He's going to seek out and destroy him.
The main attack on the Army of Northern Virginia came in May at a place that had already won a gruesome reputation during the fighting that had occurred only 1 year earlier. This was the dense forest known as the Wilderness near the old battlefield of Chancellorsville. The chaotic nightmare of the battle in the thick woods, where the choking smoke made it almost impossible to see, can hardly be imagined. Men, sometimes entire units, got lost. Some fired upon their own troops in the confusion. The soldiers of the North and South fired at each other from point-blank range, and some men were literally cut in two by the hail of bullets. If this hell on earth were not enough, the dry tinder of the forest was set alight, and many wounded men, unable to move in the brush, were burnt alive by the flames. Despite the desperate ferocity of the fighting, neither side was able to gain victory. Lee was not beaten, nor was he outflanked. And after a 2-day struggle, 28,000 dead or wounded men lay on the battlefield. This was almost 20% of those who had taken part. This time, the Union commander was not prepared to sit back and lick his wounds. "I will fight it out on this line if it takes all summer," Grant had told Lincoln. And he was as good as his word. He marched with his army towards Spotsylvania Courthouse, some 12 miles southwest of Fredericksburg, where Lee, who had anticipated the move, was waiting for him.
By 1864, after years of enduring aimed rifle fire from the rifled mini musket, and by 1864 you're starting to see magazine-fed rifles as well. First thing everybody does is start digging. And at Spotsylvania Courthouse we see the emergence of trench warfare to make incremental gains rather than breaching the enemy's defense in a single mad rush.
At Spotsylvania, the Confederates had constructed an impressive set of earthwork defenses that must have looked impenetrable to the Union troops. From May 10th to the 19th, these earthworks were to be the scene of particularly vicious combat. The names given to parts of them, the Mule Shoe and Bloody Angle, have endured as reminders of the new depths of savagery reached on one grim day, May 12th, 1864.
Well, the Battle of Spotsylvania actually lasted almost a month, but that day, the 12th of May, was certainly one of the bloodiest days of the war, and that was when the Army of the Potomac, all 20,000 men, stormed the Confederate defenses and charged into the belly of Lee's army. And from the southern viewpoint, it was like this huge wall of blue bearing down on them. It was 20 hours of close fighting, really ugly hand-to-hand combat. There was an oak tree there, 2 feet thick, which was actually cut down by a hail of bullets coming from 2 different directions. Much the same way as Lee's army was cut in two for a while before they were able to get some reinforcements and push the Federals back. But the stump of that oak tree was put on display later at the World's Fair and sent to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, and it's still on display now. It's a symbol of the ferocity of the Civil War and that battle in particular.
The casualty figures from Spotsylvania defy belief. 14,000 men had been killed. 16,000 more were wounded. In just a few hours of grim slaughter, the entire area had been turned into an enormous graveyard, where the bodies of the dead lay together with the wounded and dying in the torrential rain that came to drench the battlefield.
They said that the rain seemed to be trying on nature's behalf to wash away the bloodstains that the so-called civilized human beings were spilling on the surface of the earth. In that horrible rain at the Bloody Angle, the Union was able to just keep on pouring people against the rebel fortifications. And Lee was still able, by dint of being properly dug in, to hold out for a very long time.
While this carnage at Spotsylvania was taking place, Sheridan was making progress to the rear of Lee's position, where he began to pose a serious threat to Richmond. Sheridan orchestrated a campaign of destruction that saw railroads ripped up, supplies destroyed, supply lines cut, and telegraph lines torn down. On top of all this, Sheridan claimed a famous scalp at the Battle of Yellow Tavern, where the legendary Confederate cavalryman Jeb Stuart, a Southern icon and hero, was killed.
Jeb Stuart was the last of the Cavaliers, and he was nothing if not conspicuous. He'd ride around with this huge, billowing, silk-lined cape, and he had this sort of lush, plumed slouch hat. And he made a very inviting target. His uniform was always getting snipped by bullets, and I think at one point he actually had his mustache shot off his face, or half of it. Straight out of a Bugs Bunny cartoon, really. So that day at Yellow Tavern, one of his aides warned him that he was too exposed, and Stewart said, nonsense. There's no danger here. And he rode to the front of his lines and was firing his pistol into the air to encourage his men. And he caught a bullet in the belly from one of George Custer's sharpshooters.
James Earl Brown Stewart would die in his home state of Virginia at the Battle of Yellow Tavern, attempting, as he always does, to disrupt the federal lines and to cause havoc amongst federal troops. This time, however, his forces are overwhelmed, and Union cavalry, using quick-firing carbines, as well as Union infantry, catch his troopers in the open. He dies as he lived, fighting with pistol in hand.
Meanwhile, in the battle of wits between Grant and Lee, the scene had moved to a small crossroads near the Chickahominy River called Cold Harbor. This was to be yet another small, insignificant point on the map that would achieve bloody infamy. For despite the maze of defensive earthworks that confronted Grant and his troops when they arrived on the 31st of May, the Union commander was determined to mount an all-out attack.
Grant was in hot pursuit of General Lee, carrying out his strategy of trying to pin down and destroy those Southern forces. However, when he catches up with Lee at Cold Harbor, he finds that Lee has his troops entrenched behind strong fortifications. There were a couple of delays in transportation that allowed this to happen. Therefore, Grant has two options. One, he could sit and wait and even possibly attempt to flank. Two, he could attack. Grant, being the risk taker that he is, decides that he would use a large charge, one momentous charge, to try to crack the Confederate lines. He should have learned by Lee's mistake at Gettysburg that this would be disastrous.
At 4:30 a.m. on June 2nd, 60,000 men began their fateful march towards the Confederate positions.
They get up out of the trenches. They go over the top, in the phrase of a later war, and they attack the rebel trench system. And the rebels just cut them to pieces. It's a good thing that Sam Grant can outspend Bobby Lee in human material, because at Cold Harbor, Grant does exactly that.
Men were cut to pieces by the hail of Southern shot and shell, and they fell in tangled heaps as they tried to storm the Confederate defenses. Hardened veterans later claimed to have seen nothing like it, even on the killing grounds of Antietam, Fredericksburg, Gettysburg, and Spotsylvania. It was not war, wrote one Confederate soldier, it was murder. Nothing was gained by the Union assaults. Although Grant wrote after the war how much he regretted ordering the attack, he seems to have had no doubts at the time, for he certainly entertained the idea of a second assault. Cold Harbor did a great deal of damage to Grant's reputation, and further fueled the Northern public's sense of war weariness and anger at the way the war was being prosecuted. But the Union commander was nothing if not determined. He redeemed himself within days of the Cold Harbor debacle with a brilliant tactical maneuver across the James River that convinced Lee that the Federal forces were intending to attack Richmond. In fact, Grant's real objective was Petersburg, a town and vital rail junction that lay to the south of Richmond, and the place from where the Confederate capital received many of its supplies. Grant's plan was obvious: capture Petersburg, cut off supplies to Richmond, and starve it into surrender.
Petersburg was almost completely undefended. I think there were like 5,000 of Beauregard's men holding out against a Federal assault, 3 times as large. And Beauregard had actually sent a messenger to Lee pleading for reinforcements, and Lee refused. He said, "No, you must be mistaken. Grant hasn't moved any of his forces south of the James River." So Petersburg really was there for the taking, and the North blew it.
Perhaps because the recent memory of the failed assaults at Cold Harbor was still in the minds of the Union commanders, They failed to use their overwhelming numerical superiority to punch through the Confederate defenses. And what happened is Lee is able to get his soldiers in to the Petersburg defenses, which were already well constructed. Trench lines, strong points, abattis, other sorts of obstacles. He was able to get his troops behind those defenses while the rest of the Army of the Potomac comes up. And by the time Lee gets his army in there, the Army of Northern Virginia, combined with Beauregard's forces, will prove to be a formidable force. Grant will realize that I'm going to have to settle down to a siege once again.
Petersburg, poorly defended and ripe for the taking, trembled in anticipation of a huge northern attack. But it never came, and a glaring opportunity to shorten the war was lost. If the beleaguered President Lincoln thought that matters could get no worse for the North, he was wrong. Within weeks, Confederate forces under General Jubal A. Early, who was detached from the Army of Northern Virginia, had crossed the Potomac to stand on Washington's very doorstep. Early had come from the Shenandoah Valley, where all attempts to defeat the Southern forces had failed. But Early's Confederate army was small, perhaps some 15,000 men, and it had no hope of overwhelming Washington, let alone holding it. So Early took his troops back into Virginia, but not before part of his raiding force burnt down the Pennsylvania town of Chambersburg, an act of retribution for similar acts in many parts of the South. At the siege of Petersburg, there came a new development, the brainchild of one of Ambrose Burnside's officers. A long tunnel was dug under the Confederate positions. It was packed with nearly 4 tons of gunpowder and intended to blow everything and everyone above it to smithereens. Then Northern troops would storm what remained of the Southern lines. On July 30th, the enormous explosion tore the Confederate lines apart, spewing earth, debris, and human bodies into the air. There was panic and confusion among the surviving Southern troops as they surveyed the huge crater left by the blast. Tragically, Phase 2 of the operation did not proceed so smoothly. In fact, it was to provide the war with another of its great, costly disasters.
It took a month to dig 500 yards across no man's land and put 4 tons of dynamite into the mine that went under the rebel line. An entire regiment disappeared into the earth when the Union blew that mine. And the Union charges into that breach.
And they get to the rim of the crater, they are as stupefied and as in awe as the Confederates. About 300 Confederate soldiers have been blown to smithereens. There's body parts lying all around. There's a 30-foot deep hole in the ground. These soldiers basically just mill around. Some of them are foolish enough to actually go down inside the crater.
The hole blasted by the Union miners is just wide enough to pack a whole lot of Union guys into and pack them into a killing ground. And they were massacred by the rebel forces to either flank. They were massacred by rebel artillery in depth. And the result was that they'd blown physically a big hole in the rebel line, but it was a matter of minutes, really, for rebel soldiers to dig a new line of trenches around the edge of that mine at Petersburg. And there was a physical hole in the rebel line, but the rebel defense was not disrupted.
The unremitting bad news for the Union in the first half of 1864 had hardly helped President Lincoln's chances of re-election. Lincoln himself expected to lose, and the election campaign was given an edge when the Democrats announced their nominee. He was none other than George B. McClellan, the man who had once commanded the Army of the Potomac and who had been dismissed by Lincoln. McClellan, it seemed, was back to have his revenge. With the odds stacked against him, only final victory in the field would help Lincoln's campaign. Renewed hope for this came in the formidable shape of William T. Sherman, who was appointed and ordered by Grant to take the prize of Atlanta, Georgia.
The rebel army can do the math as well as anybody else. They look at a map and they see that Chattanooga to Atlanta, which was the industrial heartland, if there was one, of the Confederacy, was 100 miles, about the same distance as Washington to Richmond. And they'd spent the whole war bashing their heads against the problem of getting to Richmond, because that was the political heart of the Confederacy. Well, why not just go from Chattanooga to Richmond, the industrial heart of the Confederacy, win the war that way? So while Grant, as General-in-Chief, is personally commanding the army in the politically sensitive East, Sherman is going for Atlanta from the West.
Sherman, in his total war strategy, did something that many soldiers or many generals at this time were afraid to do. He would cut away from his supply base so that he wouldn't have soldiers stretched out for long distances, so he wouldn't be reliant on supplies so far away that could be possibly cut off by Confederate cavalry. Allow his army to live on the land and move as needed. It gave him a lot of freedom.
The rebels' strategy for dealing with Sherman's advance towards Atlanta is essentially to give him enough rope to hang himself. Let him come, let him come, let him come. He'll make a mistake, and we'll destroy him. But he never makes the big mistake. And by the time they realize that, there is William Tecumseh Sherman, and he's standing outside Atlanta.
In the city of Atlanta itself, there was utter panic, and its citizens, desperate to escape from the oncoming Union Army, soon crowded the roads that led out of the city. In a last throw of the dice, Jefferson Davis decided on a new commander for the defending Southern Army, replacing General Joe Johnson with the 31-year-old, one-legged John Bell Hood. Despite having lost the use of an arm at Gettysburg, Hood was patently unsuited to high command. His attempts to halt Sherman's advance ended in bloody and very costly defeats. Union shells soon began to fall on Atlanta, a bombardment that was maintained with ruthless efficiency by Sherman, despite Hood's protests that innocent civilians were in harm's way. On September 1st, 1864, Atlanta fell.
Sherman recognizes that in modern industrial war, the idea that a citizen is non-combatant, even though he works in a factory making artillery rounds, or making wagons to haul the artillery rounds, or dealing in horses to pull the wagons to carry the artillery rounds. The citizens of Atlanta could not be viewed as non-combatants in a modern industrial war. And therefore, Sherman had to destroy Atlanta. And when Mayor Calhoun of Atlanta pleaded with Sherman, don't destroy our city, Sherman replied in the famous phrase, "War is cruelty and you cannot refine it." It often translated just as war is hell.
"Atlanta is ours and fairly won," wrote Sherman to a relieved Lincoln. While the North rejoiced, the Federal Army put the city to the torch. Only churches and some private residences were spared. Abraham Lincoln's presidential prospects rose phoenix-like from the ashes of Atlanta. The tide was turning. Now it was the South receiving all the bad news. Hard on the heels of the fall of Mobile Bay and Atlanta came word of events in the Shenandoah Valley, where Grant had entrusted to Philip Sheridan the task of finally clearing the valley of Confederates. The pugnacious, ruthless cavalryman had once again gone about his task with gusto.
The whole country, from the Blue Ridge to the North Mountains, has been made untenable for a rebel army. I have destroyed over 2,000 barns filled with wheat and hay, and 70 mills, driven 4,000 head of stock before the army, and killed 3,000 sheep. When I am through, the valley will have but little in it for man or beast.
At Cedar Creek on October 19th, General Early attacked Sheridan's army as it slept, achieving a significant advantage. But the diminutive Union commander somehow rallied his troops and drove the Confederates from the field. 3,000 Southern troops were lost in this final attempt to keep the Shenandoah Valley open to the Confederacy.
When you think about it, it's quite remarkable that the presidential election of 1864 ever took place at all. The country's in the midst of a civil war, a bloody civil war, and now you're going to hold a free election in one section of the country. But that was what made the Republic great at that time. The election of 1864 was basically a referendum on two things: the continuation of the war to the final surrender of the Confederacy, and it was a referendum on emancipation.
The war lasted longer than a lot of people had expected. You had peace Democrats calling for peace. There was war weariness throughout the North. However, it sets a precedence because Americans, though they may have disagreed with Lincoln, were not ready to change horses in the middle of the stream, especially if this horse was victorious. And when Sherman was able to capture Atlanta, which was the gem of the South, it was just one more victory, one more star on Lincoln's shoulder. And so American people thought, if we are going to win the war, and if this president is winning the war, well, maybe we should stay with him.
On November 8, 1864, Abraham Lincoln was re-elected as president. It was a remarkable personal triumph for Lincoln, and another humiliation for McClellan, who had carried only 3 states, Kentucky, Delaware, and New Jersey. With 54% of the popular vote, Lincoln had his mandate from the country, and McClellan, who was particularly graceless in defeat, hurried off to Europe, cursing his opponent and the result. Most gratifying for Lincoln must have been the results of the vote from the Army. 78% of serving soldiers had voted Republican.
Had Lincoln lost and McClellan won, the South may have gained its independence, and the North may have had to go to war again with the Southern Confederacy in an attempt to reunify. Slavery would have lasted a lot longer, or the United States may have just remained split in half. One the U.S., other the CSA. But with the re-election of Lincoln, the North pursued reunification and was successful in bringing the Southern states back into the fold.
With the political uncertainty behind him, Lincoln was once again able to turn his full attention to military matters. He now had formidable commanders to steer the North to victory. Grant, Sherman, and Sheridan had all proved themselves ready, willing, and able to bring the South to its knees. All had made costly mistakes, but had also won vital victories. And Lincoln knew that these were the men upon whom he must rely to finally defeat the Confederacy. Sherman, like Sheridan, a most ruthless advocate of total war, begged to be allowed to take his army through Georgia towards Savannah before turning north through the Carolinas and into Virginia. "I intend to make Georgia howl," promised Sherman. not noted for going back on his word. And so, in mid-November 1864, Sherman's army of 62,000 men in two vast columns set off on its 300-mile march toward Savannah and the sea. They burned, destroyed, plundered, and pillaged as they went. We destroyed all we could not eat, burned their cotton and gins, spilled their sorghum, burned and twisted their railroads, and raised hell generally, wrote one Union soldier. One plantation owner who was left with nothing after Sherman's army had moved on remembered, "They came on like demons."
The end result of Sherman's destructive war that he's waging on the Southern people is that it demonstrates to these people that their governments, their state government and the Confederate government, Richmond, is not upholding one of its important missions, which is to protect them. Women who live in those areas and whose husbands are off fighting the war with the Confederate armies are writing letters saying, you know, the Union vandals have come through and destroyed the farm, have taken our food, you know, we have nothing to eat. And what will happen is that men will begin to desert in large numbers to go home and to defend their families. It makes Jefferson Davis look particularly impotent. He's having a difficult time controlling the governors of some of the southern states, in particular Georgia and North Carolina. He's going to have a much tougher time after Sherman's march. But by this time, the end of the Confederacy is in sight anyway.
Meanwhile, John Bell Hood did his best to distract Sherman by invading Tennessee. The Union commander ignored him, and in any case only had to wait until November 30th, when Hood came to grief at Franklin at the hands of George Thomas's Union force. Here, more than a quarter of Hood's once proud Army of Tennessee was killed or wounded, and the remainder was scattered in confused defeat. 6 Confederate generals were killed, including Patrick R. Cleburne, known in the Southern Army as the Stonewall of the West. Although there was no doubting Hood's devotion to the cause, better to die 1,000 deaths than to submit to live under you, he had told the North. The gamble to place him in command had failed. At the Battle of Nashville on December 15th, the Army of Tennessee was virtually destroyed, and within weeks, Hood tendered his resignation.
Sherman estimated that he'd caused about $100 million worth of damage on that march. So when the shortages really began to hit the Confederacy, that's when Southern morale went into its final decline. Certainly the Confederate officer of ordnance, the secretary of the chief of ordnance, was saying that there was no money in the treasury. There was no food to feed Lee's army. He couldn't find any troops to chase Sherman anywhere. The money had run out. And meanwhile, Lincoln was telling his Congress that his resources were unexhausted and, in fact, inexhaustible.
As long as Robert Lee could himself oppose anyone trying to get into the heartland of the Confederacy, as long as the Western theater was far away, far from the day-to-day concerns, certainly of Richmond, it was possible for the Confederacy as a body politic to pretend that they could be defended and they could be preserved by the military genius of Robert E. Lee. But as Grant came crushing down from the north through Virginia, and as Sherman came roaring through the south, from the west, through Georgia, marching to the sea, it was demonstrated quite clearly to the Confederacy that as a state they could not survive against the United States.
On December 21st, Savannah fell to Sherman's army. "I beg to present you as a Christmas gift," he wrote to a delighted Lincoln, "the town of Savannah, with 100 heavy guns, plentiful ammunition, and 25,000 bales of cotton." The new year of 1865 brought little prospect of relief, let alone victory, for the South. Its army was a pitiful sight, down as it was to less than 200,000 ill-fed and badly shod troops. The weather was freezing, and soldiers, many of whom were receiving heart-rending letters telling of the hardships at home, were deserting at a higher and higher rate. Soon, the Confederate Congress had passed a law that earlier in the war would have been considered unthinkable. It provided for the arming of slaves for the defense of the Confederacy. Although they were promised their freedom in return, few slaves took advantage of an offer made by a dying government whose individual states had seceded 4 years earlier, primarily to protect the right of their citizens to own slaves. Sherman continued to cut a swathe through Southern lands. Columbia, South Carolina's capital, all but disappeared in flames, but the Northern general was untroubled by any qualms or doubts about his actions. "I never shed any tears over it," he said afterwards. "I believe it hastened what we all fought for, the end of the war."
In South Carolina, the men take particular glee in destroying the infrastructure of that state. After all, in their minds, South Carolina was the state that started the Civil War. They were the first state to secede from the Union. That is where Fort Sumter was located, and Fort Sumter was fired upon by Confederate forces. Consequently, when Union forces entered the state capital of Columbia, South Carolina, it's destroyed with particular wantonness. Fires rage for days in that city. A lot of civilian property is intentionally destroyed. And then Sherman's troops continue their march northward.
In February, Charleston joined the growing list of Southern cities that had fallen before Sherman's army. Although retreating Confederates burned some cotton stores and military installations, Charleston was spared the wide-scale destruction that Columbia had suffered. And still, the politicians in the South, most noticeably Jefferson Davis, declined to give up the fight. Peace deals were talked about, but Davis insisted that the independence of the South and the preservation of slavery were to be part of any settlement. Inauguration Day fell on March 4th, 1864. Lincoln's speech was once again eloquent and elegant in equal measure.
With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for who shall have borne the battle, and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations.
Listening intently in the audience was a man who would very soon leave his own indelible mark on the nation's history. He was the actor John Wilkes Booth. Meanwhile, Grant, Meade, and the Army of the Potomac were still besieging Petersburg. Lee had been made overall commander-in-chief of the Confederate forces in February 1865, but his was a hopeless task. The ragtag Southern army that defended Petersburg and Richmond numbered less than 30,000 men. Food and ammunition were running out fast, and Grant had the bit between his teeth. Sheridan was dispatched to cut off Lee's supply lines to the southwest, and the Confederate leader realized that soon he would be trapped. Somehow, on April 2nd, he managed to withdraw his army and head west.
In Petersburg, before the Union troops broke through Confederate lines, Lee was left with a few die-hard soldiers. Desertion, starvation had taken their toll on Lee's army. And so he had approximately 35,000 troops left. Once the Union soldiers had broken through, captured Petersburg, captured Richmond, the various groups of soldiers retreated, and Lee hoped that they could reunite at Amelia Courthouse and then attempt to march to Danville, where they could cross over into North Carolina and hook up with General Joe Johnson. But what happens is he ends up fighting a series of running battles with Union troops, and his path is blocked at near Appomattox Courthouse by cavalry troopers under General Phil Sheridan. At this point, he doesn't run.
Petersburg was now in Union hands, and the following day, on April 3, 1865, Richmond, the Confederate capital, also fell. The government of Jefferson Davis was not there to witness the historic moment, of course. They had fled when the news from Petersburg came through. Fires intentionally started by fleeing Confederates that were meant to deny Union troops the spoils of war soon spread. Only the hard work of the advancing Union soldiers, troops of General Godfrey Weitzel's all-African-American 25th Corps, saved the city from complete destruction. On April 4th, Lincoln himself was able to walk through the ruined streets of the capital of the Confederacy. For a while, a troop of African-American cavalrymen accompanied him. A powerful, if unwitting, symbol of what Northern victory meant to the Southern slave population. Lee and his army marched west towards the mountains of Virginia with Grant in hot pursuit. There was more bloodshed at Sailor's Creek on the 6th of April, where more than 8,000 Confederates were taken prisoner. By Palm Sunday, April 9th, the tiny Southern army was completely surrounded, and Lee realized the end was near. "There is nothing for me to do but go and see General Grant, and I would rather die 1,000 deaths," said Lee to his subordinates. The two men met in a now famous scene in the home of Wilmer McLean at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia.
Many Americans believe to this day that when Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia surrendered at the tiny hamlet of Appomattox Courthouse in Appomattox County, Virginia, that the Civil War was over. It wasn't. It was the surrender of one Confederate army. There were still several Confederate armies still in the field, still in active hostilities against the United States forces. But I think it becomes symbolic. This was the premier Eastern Confederate Army surrendering to the premier Eastern Union Army. And it was only a matter of time after the Army of Northern Virginia surrendered that the other armies would follow suit.
Union soldiers have been instructed not to gloat, but to treat their adversaries with the reverence that they deserved. These soldiers had fought the hard fight, fought the hard battle. They had starved and bled for years. And what was left fighting with Lee was a battle-hardened group of men. So when they marched into the courthouse, there weren't many people there. What was left were the slaves who were watching as these Confederate veterans marched up the road preparing to surrender.
The terms that General Grant gave to General Lee were very favorable to the Confederates. He basically said that I'm going to parole you all, and you are going to go home to your families and promise not to take arms against the United States again. And as long as you remain lawful citizens, that the U.S. government's not going to bother you.
Grant asked Lee if he had any requests, and Lee thought about it and said yes, he had one. Most of his men had come to the war with their own farm animals, horses and mules and the like. Could they return to their farms with these animals for the spring plowing? And Grant said yes, and Lee was very grateful, thought that that would do a lot to conciliate his men towards the new situation.
What Grant is doing by giving them their horses back is saying, we are not going to treat you as the Romans treat Carthage. We will not sow your fields with salt. As part of the nation building that must go along with a Union victory, you will be allowed to have your economy back as well. So the rebels' surrender and the terms which Grant offers are tremendously rich in cultural symbolism. Grant offers the rebels their honor and their economy back in return for surrendering.
And so, the American Civil War, the Great Rebellion, was finally at an end. Lee was dignified and courteous in defeat, Grant and Sherman magnanimous and reasonable in victory. The South had been decimated. More than 250,000 of its menfolk lay in graves. Its economy was ruined, its countryside laid waste, and many of its towns and cities razed to the ground. For the entire region, a way of life had been ended. The South had fought hard for what it believed, but eventually it had been dragged kicking and screaming into a union it despised and now resented. The road to recovery would be long and painful for a once proud nation. The celebrations in the North were long and loud, but they were surely born more of relief than jubilation. Lincoln was determined to begin the process of binding the nation's wounds, but there was still one more act in the tragedy of the war to be played out. On April 14th, the president visited Ford's Theater in Washington to see a production of the play My American Cousin. During the performance, a shot from a Derringer pistol rang out, and amid the screams, the President of the United States lay dying from a wound to the head. The gun had been fired by John Wilkes Booth, a disgruntled actor and self-styled Southern patriot. The man who had only the previous month listened to Lincoln's inauguration speech and who had determined that the architect of the South's defeat must die. Lincoln's name was the most famous of the 620,000 names of those who died during the American Civil War. The nation had seen nothing like it before and has known nothing like it since. Many wars against foreign foes have been fought in places all across the globe. Each has its own place in the pantheon of U.S. history and in the hearts of the American people. But none, perhaps, has left scars like that conflict in the far-off 19th century, when American fought American in a bitter struggle for the soul of a nation.